Hi guys. Tonight we step into the frozen breath of early America, when the world past the colonies stretched wild and unknown. You can almost feel the first sting of cold air slicing through the forest as dusk falls, smell the damp musk of wood smoke, and hear the faint groan of trees bending under frost. You picture yourself standing outside a rough-hewn cabin on the edge of the wilderness, somewhere beyond the reach of cities and comfort. Your breath turns to mist. The sky glows with that particular steel blue shimmer that means winter is no longer a whisper, it is arriving. And if you were living here 200 years ago, you probably would not survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love for you to comment with your location and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, and let's walk straight into the story. You trudge along a leaf-strewn trail in late autumn. The earth is already frozen in places, and every step crunches like cracked glass. Behind you, a small cabin leans against the edge of a clearing, smoke curling from a crude chimney. The forest presses close, the trees crowding like sentinels. You can smell pine resin, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. Above, crows cry sharply, as though warning that this peace will soon vanish. The frontier in the 18th and early 19th centuries was an unforgiving place. Settlers moved west with hope more than knowledge, carrying little more than what they could fit on a wagon. Many had never known a winter without markets or neighbors within shouting distance. The first frost was both beautiful and terrifying. It painted the world silver but also closed off escape. Roads turned to ruts, streams to mirrors, and the long stretch of survival began. You tighten your cloak against the cold and think about those who came before you, clearing land with hands already stiff from chill. Some built quickly, piling logs with desperation as nights dropped below freezing. Others lingered too long and paid the price when snow trapped them in half-finished shelters. Historians still argue whether the first European pioneers underestimated winter out of ignorance or arrogance. Either way, they learned fast. There's a strange peace in the frontier's early winter. The forest quiets, the birds disappear, even the river moves slower, sluggish beneath a film of ice. But that peace is deceptive. For every serene snowfall, there's a storm waiting to bury entire settlements. You can imagine the sound of wind battering wooden walls, a wolf's distant howl slipping through cracks, and the faint creak of timbers under snow's heavy weight. The air itself becomes an adversary, clean, sharp, and merciless. Still, there's wonder too. You watch the first frost form on your mittens and glisten like spun glass. Each breath feels strangely alive. The people who settled this land often wrote about that duality, the awe and the agony of winter. One woman on the Pennsylvania frontier described it as a season both of death and of purity, where life was forced into silence so it could later be reborn. You can almost see her, tending a fire while her children sleep under quilts sewn from worn-out clothes. As you wander through this imagined landscape, the colors fade. Everything becomes shades of grey and white, and even time seems to slow. The settlers noticed it too. They marked the year not by months but by tasks. The last harvest, the first freeze, the first night the well water turned to ice. Each was a small alarm bell ringing against complacency. Winter demanded vigilance. By December, the rhythm of life changed completely. Days shortened to mere flickers of light, and every activity revolved around staying warm and fed. The body-adapted hands grew calloused, faces windburned, and movements economical. You can feel that in your own shoulders as you picture hauling logs or breaking ice for water. Fatigue became constant, but so did resilience. One curious detail that rarely makes it into the romantic stories is how settlers learned to predict cold spells by the sound of trees. On the coldest nights, the sap inside trunks froze and expanded until the wood cracked with loud, echoing pops. The frontier called it the forest's gunfire. It was nature's own reminder that everything alive was under pressure. Historians still debate which early winter was the deadliest, 1780, when the Hudson River froze solid and even the sea ice reached the Carolinas, or the winter of 1816, when volcanic ash from halfway around the world dimmed the sun and crops failed. You can pick any of them, and the story feels the same: families huddled by faint fires, counting dwindling supplies, whispering prayers that spring would come before hunger did. In this moment, standing in the first frost, you sense that deeper truth of the frontier. It wasn't a tale of endless bravery, but of small, persistent acts of survival, mending boots, chopping wood, rationing food. It's easy to imagine romance in the wilderness from the comfort of a warm bed. But here, every breath burns in your lungs, every step risks frostbite, and yet, somehow, people stayed. You pause by the cabin door and glance toward the woods one last time. The snow begins to fall again, soft and quiet. The flakes catch in your hair, melt against your lips and vanish. In that instant, the enormity of the task ahead settles in your bones. You are not fighting the wilderness. You are learning to live with it. The first frost has come, and the long winter has begun. Inside, the fire flickers weakly. It's not much, but it's life. And as you close the door behind you, you know that everything from this moment forward, every chore, every choice will be shaped by that relentless cold pressing just outside the walls. You wake to the soft creak of timber and the thin light of morning seeping through gaps in the cabin walls. Your breath fogs in front of your face before fading into the cold air. The night fire has died down to faint orange embers, and frost rims the inside of the window pane. You wrap your blanket tighter around your shoulders and realize something that every settler eventually learns. A cabin is not simply a house, it is a shield, a statement of will against the winter. The first real job of any frontier family was building that shield. The work began long before the cold arrived, usually in the late spring when the land was soft enough to dig and the trees full of sap. You can picture yourself swinging an axe, the rhythmic thud echoing through the valley. Chips of pine and oak scatter at your feet. Every cut smells sharp and alive, a mix of resin and damp bark. By sunset, your hands ache, your shoulders burn, and the forest seems both conquered and eternal. To the early settlers, choosing the right spot for a cabin was almost an art form. They looked for high ground to avoid flooding, shelter from wind, and trees thick enough to provide logs, yet open enough to let in light. Some placed their cabins facing south to capture more sunlight during the short days of winter. Others built near streams for easy water access, though that also invited trouble when the ice broke in spring. Historians still debate whether the earliest frontiersmen learned these tricks from indigenous neighbors or through brutal trial and error. Probably both. Once a site was chosen, construction began with astonishing speed. You needed 4 walls before the first frost, or you were finished. Settlers often built what they called a half-faced camp, a crude shelter with 3 sides and a roof, just enough to sleep in while the main cabin took shape. The smell of fresh-cut timber, the sticky feel of sap on fingers, and the constant sound of hammering filled the short summer days. Each log was notched carefully, stacked one atop another, and sealed with mud, clay, or a mix of straw and animal hair. They called this mixture chinking. It looked rough, but it kept out the biting wind surprisingly well. Inside, the walls were bare and crude. The floor was usually packed earth, sometimes covered with straw or animal skins. Nails were rare and precious, so everything was held together by pegs and notches. You can almost feel how each joint had to fit perfectly, because even a small gap meant a winter draft creeping across the room at night. When the cold came, it found every weakness. A good cabin had a single fireplace, built of fieldstone gathered from nearby creeks. The chimney was often made of sticks coated in clay, and more than one settler watched his home catch fire because of that design flaw. Frontier life was full of such bitter ironies. Build to survive the cold, and you might burn instead. Historians still argue whether these early designs came from European habits unsuited to North America's harsher winters or were adapted from native traditions that understood how smoke and warmth needed to breathe together. You can imagine the pride of finishing the roof, just as the first snowflakes began to fall. The sound of them landing on the shingles would be the sweetest music after months of labor. Yet the work never truly ended. A cabin was a living thing that had to be tended. Logs shifted, clay cracked, and snow piled high against the door. Every morning you'd inspect the walls, feeling for the smallest draft with the back of your hand. Every evening, you'd hear the wood creak and settle as if sighing against the cold. There was a quiet companionship in that sound. Many diaries mention how settlers began to feel their homes almost breathe with them through winter. One woman in Vermont wrote that she could tell the weather by the way her cabin groaned at night. A sharp snap in the beams meant deep cold coming. A gentle moan meant snow. To modern ears that might sound fanciful, but when your life depends on wood and fire, even the smallest noise becomes a kind of language. Not all cabins were equal. Some frontiersmen had the skill or resources to make theirs nearly luxurious for the time. They added lofts for sleeping, small windows covered in oiled paper to let in light, and even wooden shutters to keep out the wind. Others lived in what amounted to wooden boxes. You can feel the difference when you imagine lying on a bed of straw beside a smoking hearth, listening to the draft whistle through the gaps in the wall. The cold always found you eventually. One quirky detail often overlooked is how people decorated even in such hardship. Bits of cloth were hung over cracks not only for warmth but for color. Animal skulls might be mounted on the wall, both as trophies and as guardians against evil. A pot of dried herbs hung from the rafters to scent the air, and perhaps to remind them of summer. Historians still debate whether such customs were superstition, practicality, or simply a human need for beauty amid struggle. When you step outside again, the morning sun glints off a frozen world. You notice how the cabin casts a long shadow on the snow, small but steady. It stands as proof of your labor, a fragile victory against the wilderness. Inside, the warmth builds slowly as the fire catches. You can hear it crackle, feel the heat spread across your hands. The cabin may be rough, but it holds. It keeps out the wind and keeps in your breath. And in this vast, indifferent wilderness, that is enough. As you sit by the hearth, you realize that every board, every log, every smear of clay is a silent pact between you and the land. You will endure it, and it will endure you. Outside, the forest waits, still and white, patient as time itself. Inside, you stir the embers and listen to your home breathe. You wake before dawn to the sound of splitting wood. The axe rings out against the quiet like a church bell across the frozen hills. Every thud is a promise of survival. You step outside, boots crunching on snow, and see your breath curl up like smoke. The air smells of pine and frost, the kind of cold that bites your cheeks and wakes every muscle in your body. Before long, your hands are wrapped around the rough handle of the axe, and you join in the rhythm that keeps the frontier alive through winter. Firewood is more than warmth here. It is currency, comfort, and the difference between sleep and death. A grown family might burn through 15 cords of wood before the thaw. That means endless chopping, hauling, stacking, and praying. The pile holds out until spring. People quickly learned that not all wood burns the same. Oak burns slow and hot, perfect for overnight fires. Hickory gives off a steady, fierce heat but pops and sparks like gunfire. Pine catches easily but smokes too much, coating the cabin walls with soot. There's an old frontier saying, whispered with a half-smile, "Cut pine, and you'll cry twice, once when you chop it, and once when you choke on it." You can picture yourself standing in that pale morning light, swinging the axe again and again. The impact shudders through your shoulders, your breath turning into white steam. A steady rhythm sets in. Swing, crack, breathe, repeat. The cold sharpens everything. Even the smallest noise, the splinter of bark, the creak of trees, feels magnified. You pause to rest, leaning on the axe handle, and listen to the forest groan in the frost. Somewhere in the distance, a frozen branch snaps, echoing like a rifle shot. By late morning, a pile of logs stands as tall as you are. Each piece represents an hour of your life traded for another hour of warmth. Settlers sometimes gave names to their woodpiles, half joking, half serious. One journal from upstate New York mentions a farmer calling his stack the Silent Guard, as if it were a watchman against the cold. That little quirk says something about the mental strain of isolation. When snow cut you off from the world, even your firewood became company. Researchers disagree on when the first would-be gatherings began, but they were a common sight across the frontier by the early 1800s. Neighbors would come together for a day of chopping, stacking, and storytelling. Whiskey circulated, axes flashed, and songs echoed through the woods. It was one of the few times community triumphed over loneliness. These gatherings weren't just social events, they were insurance. Everyone knew that one day it would be their turn to need help. The work itself had a rhythm bordering on ritual. Men chopped while women and older children gathered kindling, their mittens stiff with frost. The smell of burning sap drifted through the air. A pot of stew simmered by the cabin, its steam mingling with the smoke. You can almost taste that thin broth of salt, pork, and potatoes, eaten with hands too numb to feel the spoon. It wasn't luxury, but it was enough to push through the cold. There is a strange beauty in how the act of chopping wood defines frontier life. It is simple, physical, and endlessly repetitive, yet it gives shape to the day. A visitor from England once wrote in his travel diary that, "To split logs in America is to split time itself," meaning that the rhythm of work measured the rhythm of survival. His observation lingers centuries later, a poetic truth born from blisters and exhaustion. As the sun begins to set, the shadows grow long and blue. The forest seems to close in again, but the pile of wood beside your cabin glows faintly in the fading light, each log a small victory. Inside, the fire crackles, throwing orange light on rough-hewn walls. The warmth seeps into your bones, slow and deep, as the day's ache fades. You think about the settlers who didn't cut enough wood before winter, and the grim stories that followed: cabins frozen shut, families burning furniture, travelers found snowbound only a mile from safety. Chroniclers of the time tell of one family in Kentucky who dismantled their porch railings piece by piece just to keep the hearth alive until March. One curiosity often mentioned in local lore is how people judged character by a person's woodpile. A neat, dry stack meant discipline and foresight. A messy, half-frozen heap meant carelessness, and neighbors would whisper about it. Frontier communities measured virtue in practical things. To be good was to be prepared. As the night deepens, you add another log to the fire and watch the flames catch, licking upward with a hungry hiss. The cabin fills with warmth and the faint scent of smoke and sap. Outside, the snow keeps falling, soft and soundless, covering the world in white secrecy. You know that every ember in the hearth started as a swing of the axe, every moment of comfort earned by labor. In that quiet glow, surrounded by the smell of burning wood and the sigh of the wind, you realize the truth that every settler learned the hard way. The frontier didn't reward bravery, it rewarded consistency. You didn't fight the cold, you fed it, one log at a time, and in return, it let you live. You wake in the dim light before dawn, your breath hanging in the air like mist. The cabin is cold again, despite the stack of firewood outside. The embers from last night's fire glow faintly, half buried under a bed of grey ash. This moment right here is the frontier's first real test. Keeping a fire alive through the night isn't just comfort. It is the difference between waking up stiff and shivering or not waking up at all. You kneel beside the hearth, stirring the ashes carefully with a stick. Beneath the dust, a few coals flicker red, stubborn little hearts refusing to die. You blow gently, and the glow brightens. A thread of smoke curls up into the air. It smells sweet, almost like caramelized wood. You feed the coals with dry twigs, patient and quiet, until the flame catches again and grows into life. The cabin begins to warm, just a little, enough to make your fingers stop aching. Frontier families treated fire as something almost sacred. They called it the household spirit. Losing it in the middle of winter could mean days of hardship trying to rekindle a flame from scratch. Matches were rare, so settlers carried live embers wrapped in bark or moss when moving between cabins. In some communities, neighbors shared fire the way others share bread. There are written accounts from New England describing how people would trek miles through snow just to borrow a shovel of glowing coals from another homestead. The very idea feels astonishing now, but in a world where a spark was life, it made perfect sense. One travel diary from the late 1700s tells of a man who built a tiny clay pot solely for carrying coals. He called it his winter heart. The phrase caught on in local lore, and even today, historians find it oddly touching, a small reminder that warmth was more than physical. It was emotional, almost spiritual. A hearth wasn't simply a fire, it was the pulse of the home. You can feel that as you sit closer, palms open to the heat. The light flickers across the rough-hewn walls, throwing moving shadows that dance like spirits. The smell of smoke clings to everything: your clothes, your hair, the very air you breathe. After a while, you hardly notice it anymore. It becomes part of you, the scent of survival. Keeping the fire alive through the night required skill and patience. Settlers often used a technique called banking. Before going to sleep, they would cover the burning logs with ashes, cutting off most of the oxygen but trapping enough heat to keep the coals alive until morning. With luck, there would be just enough life left to revive it at dawn. Some added a thick log of oak or maple to smolder slowly through the hours, what they called a sleeper log. If done right, the fire would last till sunrise. If not, the cold crept in mercilessly. Archaeologists have even found traces of fire pits built slightly below cabin floors, designed to radiate heat upward. Scholars debate whether this idea came from indigenous influence or from European peasant architecture. Either way, it shows how necessity drove invention. When the wind howled through chinks in the wall and frost formed inside windows, every small improvement could feel like a miracle. Not every attempt was successful. Many cabins filled with smoke because chimneys were poorly built or damp wood was burned. People learned to read the color of the smoke as a kind of language. Thick white meant moisture. Thin blue meant good heat. A farmer in the Ohio Valley once wrote, "The smoke tells you if your day will be long or kind." That simple wisdom still feels poetic now. And then there were the odd tricks people swore by. Some settlers tossed salt into the flames, claiming it made the fire burn cleaner. Others placed potatoes on the hearth overnight to draw out dampness. A few even believed that never letting a fire die protected the house from evil spirits. Folklorists still argue whether that belief had Old World roots or grew from frontier superstition. Either way, people clung to it through long, fearful nights. You picture yourself sitting by the fire with a tin mug of weak coffee, listening to the faint hiss of sap burning. Outside, the snow falls soundlessly, muffling every noise except the occasional groan of trees in the wind. Inside, the flames breathe softly, reflecting in your tired eyes. You think about how much human effort is contained in that small circle of warmth days of chopping, hauling, and tending. Every log is a story, every ember a moment borrowed from nature. As the cabin warms, your thoughts drift. The light flickers on a rifle hanging by the door, on a drying string of herbs above the hearth, on a rough wooden shelf lined with tin plates. This room, small and crude, becomes a world unto itself. Time slows here. The past and present fold together in the glow of the fire. You understand why so many frontier letters and journals mention that simple act of staring into the flames. It was meditation, entertainment, and prayer, all in one. Outside, dawn finally reaches the snow, turning it to silver. The cold air sneaks in through the cracks, but the fire answers it with warmth. You stretch, stir the coals once more, and add another log. The day begins again, quiet but alive. The hearth still crackles as you step to the door. You glance back at it, feeling something you can't quite name, gratitude maybe, or reverence. You know now that every winter night will be a conversation between you and that flame, and that as long as it answers, you will endure. You wake to the faint sound of movement outside. It is still dark, the kind of thick darkness that feels heavy, like a blanket pressed over the world. For a moment, you wonder if it is the wind brushing against the walls again. Then you hear it clearly, a low growl carried by the cold air. The animals are restless. You sit up slowly, heart thudding in your chest. On the early American frontier, the night is alive with more than just the wind. Your cow moans from the small lean-to behind the cabin. The chickens shuffle and cluck uneasily. You throw on your coat and step outside, lantern in hand. The air hits your face like ice water. Snow covers the ground, shining pale in the moonlight. Your breath fogs instantly, and every exhale feels too loud. You walk toward the pen, boots crunching softly, and the sound feels like an intrusion into the silence of the wilderness. Animals were lifelines in these frozen months. A single milk cow could mean survival through winter. Chickens, pigs, and hunting dogs all had their place in the fragile balance between hunger and hope, but they also attracted danger. Wolves followed their scent, creeping close to cabins under the cover of darkness. Accounts from the time describe settlers waking to find claw marks on doors or half-buried tracks circling the barn. One diary from 1794 tells of a family in upstate New York who lost every sheep in a single night when a pack slipped through the fence. You can picture the fear that must have come with those noises in the dark. The faint padding of paws on snow, the high, distant howl that echoes through the trees. Even the dogs, usually fierce, would fall silent when wolves were near. Some settlers hung strips of leather soaked in tar along fences, believing the smell repelled predators. Others tied bells to their livestock, hoping the sound would frighten animals away. Researchers still disagree about whether these measures ever worked, but the fear itself was real enough to keep people awake through the night. Dogs were both helpers and alarms. They guarded the cabin, pulled sleds, and hunted small game when food ran low. In letters from the frontier, people often wrote about their dogs with affection bordering on reverence. One woman in Kentucky described hers as the only heartbeat that answers mine when all else sleeps. Yet there were hard choices too. In the worst winters, when supplies ran out, even loyal animals became part of the grim arithmetic of survival. There are whispered accounts, half denied in official histories, of families forced to eat their own dogs or horses during the coldest years. Chroniclers of the era rarely mention such acts directly, but the silence in their journals speaks volumes. You crouch near the pen, lantern casting long shadows over the snow. Your cow looks at you with wide, dark eyes, steam rising from her nostrils. She is unharmed for now. You run your hand along her rough coat, feeling the heat of her body, the living warmth that matters more than words. The animals were not just food or tools, they were the rhythm of daily life. Their sounds, their needs, their quiet presence reminded settlers they were not entirely alone. A curious custom developed in some frontier communities. When a newborn calf survived its first winter, families would tie a strip of red cloth around its neck for luck. Folklorists suggest this tradition may have come from old European charms meant to ward off misfortune. Whether it was superstition or just a bit of hope woven into hardship, it gave people something to believe in. You listen again to the forest. The growl is gone. Maybe it was only your imagination, or maybe the wolves have retreated back into the trees, waiting for another night. You can hear the faint creak of branches rubbing against each other in the wind. Snow drifts down silently, flakes landing on your eyelashes. The world feels at once vast and claustrophobic, as if you are standing at the center of something ancient and indifferent. You head back inside, bolting the door behind you. The cabin feels small and safe, the air thick with the smell of smoke and straw. You sit by the fire, listening to it pop softly, and your dog curls up at your feet. Its fur is rough, its breathing steady. You reach down and scratch behind its ears, the small gesture grounding you in a moment of fragile peace. In the journals of early settlers, animals appear in unexpected ways, not just as food or danger, but as companions, symbols, and even teachers. One man from the Ohio Territory wrote about watching birds fly south and feeling both envy and instruction, realizing that survival was about movement, timing, and instinct. He ended his entry with a line that still feels true: "We learn to live as they do, one day to the next." As the fire burns low, you glance toward the window. Frost feathers the glass, reflecting the faint glow of the hearth. Outside, the dark seems endless. Inside, there is warmth, the steady sound of breathing, the faint smell of hay. You close your eyes, listening to the soft sigh of wind against the roof. The animals settle, the night grows quiet again, and the fragile thread between life and loss holds at least until morning. Morning comes grey and heavy with silence. The fire burns low, and your stomach reminds you that warmth is only one half of survival. You step outside, pulling your coat tight, and see the world locked in white. The snow glitters faintly, and the air smells clean and sharp. This is the season when the harvest must stretch to fill months of hunger. Whatever you put away before the freeze decides whether you'll endure or fade. The art of preserving food on the early American frontier was equal parts science, superstition, and desperation. Settlers learned fast that the land's generosity ended abruptly with the first frost. The lush gardens of summer became frozen mounds of dirt. Game grew scarce, rivers froze, and travel to trading posts was often impossible. So autumn became a race against time, a frenzy of drying, salting, smoking, and storing. Inside the cabin, you can almost smell it: the salt-soaked tang of pork, the musty sweetness of dried apples, the sharp vinegar bite of pickled beans. Women worked tirelessly over iron kettles, boiling brine or stirring bubbling molasses. Men hung strips of venison over the hearth to smoke for days, the air growing thick with the aroma of wood and fat. Each barrel, each jar, each cured side of meat represented survival in physical form. A common sight in any frontier kitchen was the smoke rack suspended above the fire. It was more than decoration. It was a lifeline. Strips of meat, fish, or sausage hung there, curing slowly in the warmth and smoke. The wood chosen for smoking mattered. Hickory gave a deep, earthy flavor. Applewood added sweetness. Corn cobs, surprisingly, produced a mild, pleasant aroma. Local law says that one clever family in Maine discovered that adding pine needles to the smoke kept insects away. That odd trick spread quietly from cabin to cabin until it became common practice. Some methods of preservation were borrowed or adapted from indigenous knowledge. Native communities had long used drying racks and earthen pits to store corn, beans, and squash, collectively known as the Three Sisters. Settlers observed these practices and learned that sealing grain in clay-lined pits could keep it edible for months. Modern historians still discuss how much of frontier survival depended on such shared wisdom, though written records rarely give credit where it is due. The cellar was the heart of a winter larder. If you lift the trapdoor in your cabin floor and descend by lantern light, the air cools instantly, smelling of damp earth and old roots. Shelves line the walls, holding jars of preserved fruit and baskets of potatoes, carrots, and turnips packed in straw. The cold keeps everything slow, almost asleep. You move carefully, mindful of each jar as though it were gold. In a sense, it is. There are stories from New Hampshire and Vermont about settlers singing quietly while working in their cellars. The sound, muffled by earth, must have felt both lonely and comforting. One surviving journal describes the habit as singing to the roots, a way to keep the cold from feeling so absolute. Whether superstition or simple sanity, it became part of the rhythm of survival. Salt was the true treasure of the frontier. It preserved meat, cured hides, and even served as currency in remote settlements. Without it, food spoiled quickly, and winter turned deadly. Some families traveled for days to find salt springs, evaporating the water in iron pans to collect the precious crystals. Others traded furs for barrels of salt brought by river traders. Archaeological finds from frontier forts still contain fragments of these salt pans, blackened by fire and time. The smell of vinegar and smoke fills your imagination as you think of those cramped winter cellars. One settler's diary mentions an unusual trick, suspending apples from the rafters on strings so they would dry slowly in the warm air above the fire. She wrote that they wrinkled like old faces but kept their sweetness. That line has survived centuries because it captures something honest, the small poetic victories of endurance. There were failures too. Fermented pickles exploded, salted meat spoiled, or barrels cracked from frost. Food poisoning was not uncommon, though few understood its causes. A letter from a frontier doctor in 1812 warns that improperly cured meats have laid many low before spring's thaw. Even now, scholars puzzle over how families manage to survive repeated winters with such limited knowledge of hygiene and preservation. The answer perhaps lies in intuition and sheer stubbornness. You lift a jar of sauerkraut from the shelf and imagine the crunch of it on a bitter night. Its sourness, a shock of life in a world of grey. That tangy dish, originally brought by German settlers, became a staple across frontier America. It stored well and provided vital vitamins during months when fresh food was impossible. Today, nutritionists know it likely saved lives by preventing scurvy, though the settlers themselves only knew it kept the blood sweet. Back upstairs, the fire crackles again. You slice a piece of smoked pork, drop it into a pot with potatoes and a handful of dried beans. The scent fills the room, earthy and satisfying. It is not a feast, but it is warmth that reaches from the stomach outward. Outside, the wind rises, carrying the faint cry of something wild in the forest. You glance toward your woodpile, your animals, and the frozen river beyond. Every resource is accounted for. Every jar and log and heartbeat must be rationed with care. The settler's greatest skill was not bravery but restraint. As you sip the thin, savory broth, you think about the rhythm of those who came before you. Cut, salt, hang, store, wait. Their world was measured in cycles of scarcity and renewal. You realize that every bite they ate through the cold months was not just food but proof of planning, persistence, and faith that the thaw would come again. The morning sky glows pale grey, the color of cold iron. You stand outside the cabin, listening to the faint groan of the river nearby. It has begun to ice over, thin layers forming along the edges like glass. You know that within days, the current will freeze solid, cutting off the easiest route to the nearest fort. If you are going to trade for salt, powder, or cloth, now is the moment. By next week, the wilderness will be a sealed world. Trading before the snows was not simply business, it was survival. Frontier families relied on barter with forts, small towns, and passing trappers. Coins were scarce, so every exchange depended on need and trust. A pelt for a pound of salt, a jar of honey for a bundle of nails, a few candles for a handful of bullets. You tie your furs into a bundle and prepare to set out, knowing that the journey itself might be more dangerous than the trade. You start down the narrow path toward the river, boots crunching through crusted snow. The air smells of pine and smoke, clean and harsh. The forest feels alive but watchful, every sound amplified by the cold. A crow calls in the distance, its cry sharp as a knife. You tighten your scarf and keep walking, one slow step after another. Travel in winter was always uncertain. Ice could snap underfoot, snowdrifts could swallow trails, and daylight vanished too quickly. Many settlers wrote of losing their way only a mile from home when storms swept in. Some never returned. It became common practice to mark trees with an axe or hang strips of cloth to guide the way back. Modern researchers still debate whether these markings had roots in native trail customs or grew out of pure necessity. By midday, you reach the frozen bank of the river. The water moves sluggishly beneath a skin of ice, creaking and shifting like a living thing. You test the surface with your boot and hear the faint, musical crack of ice under strain. Carefully, you step onto it, the cold rising through your soles. Each movement feels deliberate, cautious, almost sacred. The frontier was full of prayers disguised as practical habits. The nearest trading post might be 20 miles away, a small cluster of cabins surrounded by palisades. The journey there could take 2 days in fair weather, 3 in snow. You picture the settlers trudging through drifts with sleds piled high, their faces raw from wind. Some carried torches at night to light the path, the flames dim against the endless dark. At last, you imagine yourself stepping into the warmth of the trading post. The air smells of tobacco, damp wool, and animal hides. Voices murmur in a dozen accents, English, French, German, and native dialects blending together. The fire in the hearth crackles, casting long shadows over barrels of flour and crates of iron tool. The trader sits behind a rough counter, face weathered, hands thick with years of work. You lay your bundle of furs before him. Beaver, fox, and muskrat glisten with frost. He inspects them closely, running a calloused thumb over the pelts. Trade is quiet, measured, and wordless. A pound of salt, a tin of gunpowder, a spool of thread, and maybe, if you are lucky, a small wedge of sugar or tea. Those small luxuries taste like civilization itself. Curiously, one frontier account mentions that traders often carried tiny mirrors and colored beads for barter, not because settlers needed them, but because people still craved beauty amid hardship. Even the roughest homestead might have a string of bright beads hanging near the window, catching the pale sunlight. Historians who study these exchanges often see them as proof that survival alone was never enough. People needed small reminders of wonder. As the storm clouds gather, you share a bowl of stew with a few travelers by the fire. They tell stories of routes blocked by snow and wolves following sleds for miles. One man, half drunk on whiskey, insists he saw lights dancing above the trees at midnight, the northern lights spreading like ghost fire across the sky. The others laugh, but no one entirely doubts him. On the frontier, mystery was part of daily life. When you finally set out for home, the world has changed again. The wind cuts harder, the sky darker. You pull your coat tighter and feel the weight of your pack pressing against your back. Inside it lies more than trade goods. It holds the fragile hope of getting through another season. On the return journey, you pass the frozen river again. It groans beneath your feet, deep and resonant, as though warning that this might be the last safe crossing. You move quickly, following your own footprints back through the snow. The forest feels quieter now, as if holding its breath. By the time your cabin comes into view, night has fallen. Smoke rises weakly from the chimney. The door creaks as you push it open, letting warmth spill over you like a blessing. Inside, you unload your treasures carefully onto the table. Salt wrapped in cloth, a tin of powder, a small packet of tea. Your hands tremble slightly, part exhaustion, part relief. You sit by the fire, listening to the wind whistle around the cabin. Outside, the snow thickens, erasing your tracks, sealing the world once again. You know that for the next few months, there will be no more trading, no more journeys. The river will sleep, the paths will vanish, and all that remains is endurance. As you sip your first cup of tea in weeks, steam rising in slow spirals, you feel something close to gratitude. Every trade, every step, every choice was a quiet negotiation with the wilderness itself. You survived another crossing, and for now, that is enough. The wind whistles through the gaps in the logs again this morning, and you wake with cold fingertips despite the fire. You pull your coat closer and glance at the small pile of clothing stacked near the bed. Each piece feels rough and heavy, more functional than elegant. Out here, fashion means survival. The early settlers discovered quickly that the right layers could make the difference between frostbite and comfort, between waking up and never waking again. You touch the fabric of your wool shirt and feel its coarse warmth. Most settlers wore garments spun and woven at home. Flax became linen, Wool became coarse blankets or thick trousers, and deer hide turned into sturdy coats. Spinning wheels creaked in every cabin through autumn as women worked by candlelight, turning raw fibers into thread. The faint whir of the spindle was a familiar comfort, a sound that meant progress against the coming cold. A single shirt could take days to weave, and winter clothing required endless preparation. Some families made their own dyes using bark, berries, or even iron filings to give dull browns and greys a touch of life. You imagine your hands stained with the faint green of walnut hulls or the deep red of madder root. Colour in the dead of winter was a kind of rebellion, a statement that beauty still mattered even when the world turned white. Layering was the secret skill everyone learned fast. A thin linen shirt next to the skin, then a wool tunic, then a thick coat of hide or homespun. Trousers lined with flannel or fur, mittens stuffed with scraps of rabbit skin, boots packed with dry grass for insulation. You can feel the weight of it all pressing down as you move, like carrying your home on your body. The air bites less, but every motion becomes slower. Still, it is worth it. Frontier women had the hardest time keeping warm because long skirts trapped cold air and froze stiff in the snow. Some cut them shorter for practicality, scandalizing anyone still clinging to European modesty. Others wore men's trousers beneath their petticoats, a quiet act of rebellion that historians later called functional defiance. The details vary in accounts, but the spirit remains the same. The body must live first, reputation second. In some regions, people lined their clothes with paper or dried moss. Travelers' journals mention settlers stuffing newspaper into boots to keep their toes from freezing. It worked surprisingly well. One merchant wrote in 1818 that he preferred a Boston Gazette to a blanket for the feet. Modern researchers find that amusing, but it was pure ingenuity. When you live far from towns, creativity replaces luxury. Hats and hoods were essential too. Many families made them from rabbit fur or raccoon tails, stitched roughly but effective against the wind. The famous coonskin cap, later romanticized by storytellers, was originally a practical piece of gear rather than a symbol of adventure. Its tail hung down the back of the neck to keep snow from sliding into the collar. People learned these tricks from indigenous neighbors who had mastered winter dressing long before settlers arrived. Scholars still discuss how much of frontier attire evolved from native designs, though much credit was long ignored in popular histories. You tie a wool scarf around your neck and feel how the coarse fibers scratch slightly against your skin. The warmth spreads slowly, a physical reminder of effort made months earlier. Someone spun this wool, dyed it, cut it, and stitched it by hand. Every garment carries the touch of a person's labor. Clothing was currency and inheritance. It was patched, mended, and passed down until the fabric was more repair than original thread. A curious detail from early New England letters mentions people sleeping fully clothed in winter, not out of laziness but to preserve warmth. Families often wore hats to bed, wrapped in every blanket available, their breath frosting the inside of the quilts. Some even sewed small stones or bits of metal that had been heated in the fire into cloth pouches and tucked them beneath the covers to make a primitive hot water bottle. A few of these odd heating stones survive in museums, still darkened from years of use. As the morning light grows stronger, you step outside to fetch water from the frozen barrel. Your coat stiffens in the cold, and your breath curls upward like smoke. The weight of your clothing gives you a strange sense of security, like armor. You remember how settlers used to say, "Dress as if the wind hates you," and it feels perfectly true. The wind does not care, but the effort makes you feel defiant. Even laundry was an ordeal. Water froze before the soap could foam, and clothes stiffened into boards on the line. People sometimes hung garments inside near the fire, the steam filling the room with the smell of lye and wet wool. Diaries mention the satisfaction of that scent, unpleasant by modern standards but comforting then. It meant the work was done. The body would stay warm another day. You pause for a moment, holding the bucket of ice-crusted water. Your reflection shimmers faintly on its surface, framed by fur, wool, and frost. The figure looking back could belong to any century. Out here, the difference between past and present fades. You feel the continuity of human instinct. Cover, protect, endure. Back inside, you hang your coat by the fire and listen to the soft drip of melting snow from its hem. The warmth creeps back into your limbs. You can almost hear the faint hum of the spinning wheel again, the thread stretching between fingers, the whisper of fabric taking shape. Every stitch tells a story of patience and necessity, a quiet defiance against nature's cruelty. As night falls, you wrap yourself again in layers of wool and leather, your small cabin glowing in the dark. Outside, the world freezes solid, but inside, you carry the warmth of countless hands that wove, stitched, and prepared before you. In this shared human ritual of dressing for survival, the frontier becomes less lonely, the cold less cruel. The snow deepens until the world outside seems to vanish. When you step from the cabin, sound itself feels swallowed by white. Even your footsteps disappear almost instantly, the soft powder erasing every trace of movement. You pause, listening, but there is nothing. No birds, no running water, no crack of branches. Just the faint hiss of wind sliding through the trees. The frontier winter has its own silence, one that presses in until you can hear your heartbeat as clearly as the creak of ice. At first, this quiet feels peaceful. After weeks of chopping wood and tending fires, the stillness seems like a gift. But soon you realize how heavy silence can become. It fills the cabin like smoke, creeping into your thoughts. Many settlers wrote about the loneliness that came with winter more than the cold itself. One farmer from Michigan wrote that the stillness is not rest but a wait, and anyone who has lived through such months would understand what he meant. You walk through the woods behind your cabin, bundled so tightly you can hardly move. The air is sharp enough to sting your nostrils. Every breath echoes inside your head. The trees stand like pillars in a frozen cathedral, each one rimmed with white crystals that sparkle in the faint sunlight. Somewhere far off, a tree cracks loudly as sap freezes inside it, the sound echoing through the forest like a gunshot. For a moment, you imagine someone else walking there, but it is only the echo coming back to you. The isolation of the frontier tested the mind as much as the body. Families lived miles apart, sometimes going months without seeing another face. Snowdrifts blocked trails, rivers froze, and even letters stopped coming. Inside the cabin, you count the hours by the position of the fire rather than the Sunday. Morning begins when the embers fade to grey. Night returns when you pile on another log. A strange little fact from the journals of early settlers notes that people often talk to themselves during these months. Some even gave names to objects in their cabins, treating them as company. A woman in Vermont mentioned chatting with her broom as she swept, claiming it answered with the same dull wisdom every time. Modern historians call it a sign of loneliness. You might call it survival of the spirit. There was beauty in the quiet too, though few had time to appreciate it. The sound of snow settling on rooftops, the faint crackle of frost spreading across window glass, the rhythmic drip of melting icicles on a sunny afternoon. The world slowed to something almost sacred, and for a moment you could forget hunger and hardship. Even the silence became a kind of music once you learned to listen. Yet too much quiet could drive people to restlessness. Old diaries describe men pacing the same 10 steps inside their cabins until the floorboards wore thin. Children grew sullen or wild, mothers weary with unending stillness. Without distraction, every small worry became enormous. A cough sounded like a warning. A draft felt like doom. Researchers studying frontier life today still debate whether isolation caused more suffering than starvation. The written evidence suggests that mental strain was as real a threat as the cold itself. You pause by a frozen creek and look down. The surface is clear enough to see the rocks beneath, locked in place, unmoving. It reminds you of your own thoughts this time of year, suspended, waiting, unsure if movement will ever return. You throw a pebble onto the ice and watch it skitter across before vanishing into the snow. The sound fades quickly, swallowed again by silence. Inside your cabin that evening, the loneliness seems louder. The fire hums softly, the dog shifts in its sleep, and the wood walls creak as they settle. You pull a chair closer to the hearth and let the warmth soak into your legs. This small bubble of heat feels like a heartbeat in a frozen body. You think about the people who survived winters like this, century after century, without music, without light, without voices except their own. They left behind letters full of longing and gratitude in equal measure. One such letter from 1802 describes a woman writing by candlelight while snow covered the windows completely. She wrote to her sister, "It is as though we live beneath the earth, buried but breathing still." The image lingers, half haunting and half poetic. Scholars who study frontier writing often point out how these moments reveal resilience more than despair. Even when surrounded by silence, people found ways to keep their inner worlds alive. A few families fought the loneliness through storytelling. At night, they would gather around the fire and take turns recounting tales from home, mixing fact with imagination until the two blurred. Children listened wide-eyed, the flicker of firelight turning shadows into monsters or heroes on the wall. Some stories survived generations that way, reshaped each winter into something new. As the night deepens, you sit still and listen again. The silence outside feels endless, stretching from the hills to the horizon. Yet inside, you hear the soft pop of sap burning in the logs, the faint whistle of wind at the chimney, the steady rhythm of your own breathing. These sounds become company, proof that you still exist in a living world. You close your eyes and feel the warmth on your face. The stillness no longer feels empty but full of presence. The forest sleeps, the snow hides the land, and you are a single spark in the long, dark winter. The silence is not your enemy anymore. It is the language of endurance. The night falls thick and deep, the kind of darkness that swallows the horizon whole. The wind has stopped, and the forest feels frozen in time. You sit by the fire, its flicker reflecting on the walls like a heartbeat. The dog lifts its head suddenly, ears twitching. Then comes the sound that makes your chest tighten, a slow, deliberate knock at the cabin door. It is late, far too late for a visitor. You glance at the rifle propped near the wall and move quietly to your feet. The knock comes again, louder this time. 3 heavy thuds that echo through the small room. Your mind races through every possibility. A neighbor in trouble? A traveler lost in the storm? Or something darker? In this wilderness, the line between the familiar and the unknown is paper thin. You open the door a crack, letting a gust of cold air rush in. Outside stands a figure wrapped in furs, face hidden by frost and shadow. The voice that greets you is hoarse, cracked from wind. "Evening," the stranger says. "Fire still going?" You nod, stepping aside. He enters slowly, stamping snow from his boots, bringing the smell of frozen air and damp leather into the cabin. Encounters like this were part of frontier life. Distance made strangers both a danger and a necessity. Hospitality was sacred because everyone knew what it meant to be caught in the cold. A visitor might bring news, trade, or just company. Yet trust was fragile, earned with each cautious glance. Accounts from the time describe travelers sharing fires with people whose names they never learned, speaking quietly for hours before disappearing at dawn. You pour the stranger a cup of hot broth. His hands tremble slightly as he drinks. The firelight softens his face, older than you thought, eyes sunken but kind. He tells you he lost his way while hunting, the storm driving him off the trail. He has walked for 2 days, he says, guided only by the glow of your chimney smoke. His story feels true, though you sense there is more left unsaid. One early settler diary tells of a night much like this, when a traveler arrived out of nowhere and shared a fire until morning. At first light, he vanished without a trace. The family later found footprints in the snow that ended abruptly halfway to the woods. Folklorists have argued for years whether these tales reflected real encounters or the half-dreamed visions born of isolation and exhaustion. Either way, They captured a truth about frontier night's reality and imagination often blurred together in the dim glow of a fire. Your guest removes his gloves and holds his palms toward the heat. His skin is cracked, nails blackened by frost. You hand him a piece of bread, and he eats slowly, almost reverently. The dog watches from the corner, tail still, eyes unblinking. Outside, the wind picks up again, rattling the shutters like bony fingers. Visitors could mean safety or danger, a helping hand or a thief waiting for opportunity. One curious record from a Pennsylvania homestead describes a man who invited a pair of traders to stay for the night, only to wake and find his rifle, coat, and horse gone. The settlers afterward began keeping their rifles within arm's reach, even when showing hospitality. You can almost feel that mix of suspicion and kindness now as you sit across from the stranger, each of you silently weighing trust against need. He speaks of the land ahead, of deep snow and frozen rivers, of a group of hunters trapped by ice not far to the north. His voice carries a kind of weary calm. Whether his story is truth or caution, it reminds you how fragile life is in this wilderness. A single wrong turn, one failed fire, and the forest claims another name forgotten by spring. As the night grows late, you share a few quiet words. He asks about your homestead, your animals, how many winters you have seen. You find yourself answering honestly, perhaps because the dark makes confession easier. The two of you sit in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly between you. It feels almost peaceful. Before dawn, he rises to leave. You offer him a piece of smoked meat for the road. He accepts with a small nod, eyes reflecting the faint orange light. As he opens the door, cold air spills in again, carrying the sound of wind sweeping across the trees. You watch him step out into the snow, his figure quickly swallowed by the dark. By morning, only his footprints remain, leading into the forest. You follow them a short distance before they fade beneath drifting snow. There is no sign of him, no path, no sound except the whisper of the trees. You stand there for a long moment, listening to the quiet. Many frontier journals mention nights like this: unexpected knocks, mysterious travelers, silent disappearances. Some settlers believed these wanderers were spirits testing hospitality. Others thought they were lonely souls seeking warmth one last time. Scholars still wonder how many of those stories were true, and how many were dreams brought on by isolation and cold. Back in your cabin, you close the door gently and stir the fire. The warmth blooms again, steady and alive. The dog sighs and curls up beside you. Outside, snow keeps falling, soft and endless. You sip the last of the broth and glance toward the window, half expecting to see another figure in the trees. There is nothing, only the wilderness, vast and silent, holding its secrets beneath the white. You sit quietly for a long time, watching the fire fade to embers. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf calls once, then falls silent. You think about the stranger, about trust, about how the frontier turns every meeting into a test of faith. You are alone again, yet not entirely. The memory of shared warmth lingers, and for tonight, that is enough. The morning light filters through the frost-glazed window, pale and uncertain. You wake with a dull ache in your chest and a weight behind your eyes that feels unfamiliar. Outside, the snow glows faintly blue, the world still and bright. But inside the cabin, the air feels heavy, close, as if sickness has taken hold. You cough once, the sound echoing too loudly in the quiet room. Winter, you realize, is not finished testing you yet. Illness was one of the frontier's cruelest visitors. It came quietly and lingered long after the fire died down. Cold air seeped into lungs, and small ailments that might have passed easily in town became deadly in the wilderness. Settlers faced fevers, frostbite, infections, and all manner of unnamed aches that doctors miles away could not reach in time. The nearest physician might be a week's journey away, and by the time help arrived, it was often too late. You sit by the hearth, wrapping a shawl around your shoulders and reach for a tin cup of water. The taste is faintly metallic, drawn from the bucket near the door. You sip it slowly, letting the warmth of the fire touch your face. Across the room, a small bundle of dried herbs hangs from a beam. You remember collecting them months ago, long before the snow fell. They were meant to guard against sickness, though you are not sure how well they work. Home remedies were the backbone of frontier medicine. Families used what they had: roots, bark, herbs, and prayer. Sassafras tea for fever, willow bark for pain, garlic for infection. Women learned these recipes by memory, often passed from one generation to the next. Some settlers wrote them down in small hand-bound notebooks, smudged with soot and grease. One surviving notebook from the 1790 seconds lists a cure for lung fever that involves onion syrup, vinegar, and bear grease. Whether it ever helped is another question entirely. You crush a few leaves of mint and wintergreen into a pot of water and set it by the fire to steep. The scent fills the room, sharp and clean. For a moment, it almost feels like healing. You think of all the people who sat in rooms like this, trying to fight invisible enemies with whatever tools they could find. They burned herbs to clear the air, rubbed salves made from pine resin onto cracked skin, and whispered blessings over every cup of bitter medicine. A curious story survives from a small settlement in Maine, where a woman claimed she could read illness by feeling the pulse of the house itself, the warmth of the hearth, the creak of the floorboards, the rhythm of breath from those sleeping nearby. Whether truth or imagination, her reputation spread, and people traveled miles for her advice. Modern researchers call her one of the earliest examples of folk healers in the American Northeast. Her name, unfortunately, was lost to time. You stir the steaming pot and pour a little into a cup. The warmth burns pleasantly against your palms. You drink, wincing at the bitterness, but the heat fills your chest, easing the tightness slightly. The dog stirs in its sleep beside the fire, ears twitching. You reach down and rest a hand on its fur, grounding yourself in its steady warmth. In times of sickness, companionship often mattered as much as medicine. There were darker sides to frontier medicine too. Bloodletting and purging remained common among those who clung to old European practices. People believed sickness came from bad humors that had to be released from the body. One diary from the Ohio frontier describes a man weakened by fever who insisted on bleeding himself despite his wife's protests. He died 2 days later. Even today, scholars debate whether such practices persisted because of ignorance or simple desperation. You lie back on the bed and pull the blanket up to your chin. The ceiling above is darkened with soot, a pattern you have stared at so many times that it almost feels familiar. The fire cracks and pops, each sound marking time in slow, uneven beats. Fever blurs the edges of the room, the light flickers, and the shadows shift. You think of all those who fell sick in cabins like this and were never written into history. The mothers who tended to children through the night, the neighbors who trudged through waist-high snow carrying broth and herbs, the quiet burials at dawn when the ground was too hard to dig. Sickness was as much a part of frontier life as the cold or hunger, yet the stories of care and compassion rarely survived. A small superstition whispers at the edge of your mind, the belief that leaving a window slightly open lets sickness escape. You remember hearing that from someone long ago, and without thinking, you push the shutter a few inches. Cold air seeps in, sharp and clean. It feels both foolish and comforting, a ritual without logic but full of hope. By afternoon, your fever begins to ease. The world regains its edges. The tea sits half-finished, and the fire glows brighter. Outside, snow falls again, slow and steady. You feel fragile but alive. Every breath feels like a small victory. You reach for the small notebook on the table and write a few words in shaky handwriting. Still breathing, still grateful. It is not a grand statement, but it captures what the frontier truly was, an endless series of small survivals. As night approaches, you settle back against the pillow, listening to the wind. The herbs above you rustle faintly in the draught, releasing their scent. You think of all the healers, mothers, and stubborn souls who fought winter illnesses with courage and instinct rather than knowledge. Their efforts may not always have saved lives, but they preserved something just as precious: the belief that healing was possible. You close your eyes, letting the warmth from the hearth wash over you. The fever fades to a whisper, the pain dulls, and sleep takes its place. In this small, smoky cabin surrounded by snow, survival feels like its own kind of miracle. The next morning arrives in silence, but it is a different kind of quiet now. You wake weak but lighter, as if your body has decided to forgive you for surviving another night. The fire has burned down to faint orange coals, and the air smells faintly of herbs from the pot still simmering on the hearth. You sit up slowly, feeling the stiffness in your limbs, and glance toward the window. Outside, the world glows white beneath a pale Sunday. Snow stretches in every direction, glinting like powdered glass. The sickness has left you for now, but you know well that few things are more fragile than health in winter. You step outside for the first time in days. The cold hits your face like a slap, sharp and clean, waking every sense. The woods are still, the snow deep. You walk carefully, following the faint path toward the edge of the trees. There, near the frozen river, you see the familiar sight of smoke rising from another camp. Your neighbors are not settlers like you. They belong to the land in a way you never will. Members of a local indigenous tribe have set up their winter shelters not far from your clearing, as they have every year. You have traded with them before, shared fire, food, and words. In truth, their presence brings comfort. Frontier survival was never an isolated story, though later generations like to imagine it that way. In reality, settlers learned much of what kept them alive from indigenous people who had already mastered the rhythms of winter long before the first log cabin was built. Snowshoes, herbal medicines, hunting techniques, and winter clothing, all of it came from knowledge carried through centuries. The early colonists observed, borrowed, and often misunderstood, but the lessons remained. You wave a greeting toward the camp, and one of the hunters lifts a hand in return. A few moments later, you hear footsteps approaching through the snow. The crunch of movement grows closer until a familiar figure appears, a man wrapped in fur, face lined with years of cold and wisdom. He smiles faintly and speaks your name in his quiet, deliberate voice. You answer with your own rough greeting, and he nods, holding out a small bundle wrapped in hide. Inside is a mixture of dried plants and roots. He tells you to steep them in hot water, that they will strengthen your lungs and drive out what he calls the heavy air. You recognize the faint scent of cedar, yarrow, and something sharp you cannot name. It is medicine older than your country, older than your language. You thank him, and he only smiles again, as though gratitude is unnecessary. In this land, knowledge is not owned but shared. You walk back together toward the river, speaking little. The air is so cold that each word seems to crystallize and fall away before it reaches the ground. He shows you how to read the ice, tapping it with the handle of his spear. Listen, he says. You crouch beside him and do as he does. The sound that echoes through the ice is deep and hollow, like a drumbeat. He explains that the tone tells you how thick the ice is, how safe it might be to cross. You realize then that every sound in this frozen world carries meaning, if only you learn how to hear it. Many records from the early frontier mention moments like this, brief encounters where survival knowledge passed quietly between cultures. Yet few of those settlers wrote the truth plainly. They spoke of discovering snowshoe design or inventing herbal cures that indigenous communities had been using for generations. Modern researchers have since pieced together how deeply native wisdom shaped frontier life. Without it, many colonies would not have survived their first winters. As the two of you walk, the hunter points out tracks in the snow deer, rabbit, and something smaller. He moves with ease, his steps light and deliberate, while yours crunch heavily behind. You try to imitate his rhythm, stepping in the same places he does. The snow gives a soft sigh beneath your boots. For a moment, You feel what it must be like to belong to the land instead of merely enduring it. Back at your cabin, he accepts a seat near the fire. You brew the herbs he gave you, the steam filling the room with a scent both bitter and comforting. He watches the flames thoughtfully, then gestures to the walls, to the cracks filled with dried moss and clay. Good, he says simply, acknowledging the care you have taken. His approval feels like a small blessing. You ask him how his people manage during the worst of the storms. He smiles slightly, as though at a question a child might ask. We do not fight the cold, he replies. We move with it. The phrase lingers in your mind long after he is gone. To move with the cold instead of against it, perhaps, that is the secret you have missed all along. He leaves you with a gift, a pair of snowshoes made from bent wood and rawhide, the latticework delicate but strong. You run your hand along the smooth curve of the frame, marveling at its craftsmanship. These are not decorations, they are freedom. With them, you can walk where before you would have sunk, crossing the wide white world that once felt impassable. That night, as you sit by the fire and sip the herbal brew, you feel a calm strength return. The tea tastes strange but warming, and your breathing eases. Outside, the snow glows faintly under a rising moon. You think about how much of your life now depends on knowledge shared freely by those who understand the land better than you ever will. In your notebook, you write a few words, learned from the river, from the snow, from them. It is not enough to repay what you have received, but it keeps the memory alive. Historians in later years would often romanticize these moments or twist them into myths of conquest. Yet the truth is simpler and humbler. The frontier was not conquered, it was taught. As you prepare for sleep, you look again at the snowshoes leaning by the door and the bundle of herbs drying near the fire. You whisper a quiet thanks into the air, not knowing if anyone or anything hears it. The world outside is cold and infinite, but for now, it feels shared, not empty, and that perhaps is what survival truly means. By the time another week passes, the snow has thickened into a second skin over the land. You can hardly tell where the earth ends and the sky begins. The river that once whispered softly in the background now lies silent, frozen from bank to bank. When you step onto it, the ice creaks beneath your boots, sending deep echoes that roll like thunder under the surface. The sound makes you pause every few steps. You glance down at the faint cracks running like spiderwebs beneath your feet. The ice holds, but its song keeps you cautious. Crossing frozen rivers became an ordinary part of frontier life, though it never stopped feeling risky. People learned to listen for the difference between safe and deadly ice. Thick, dry cold made a deep, steady tone when struck with a stick. Thin ice near running water sang in higher, hollow notes. One explorer wrote that the river speaks to those who know its moods. He meant it literally. The frontier was a place where listening could save your life. You kneel beside a hole cut into the ice, a small ring of dark water surrounded by white. The smell of cold water and fish rises into the air. You drop a simple wooden trap beneath the surface, its bait already frozen stiff. The ice-cold wind bites your face as you wait, the rope trembling in your hands. After a few moments, the faintest tug tells you there is movement below. You pull carefully, and a silver flash breaks through the surface. A fish, small, shining, alive. You feel the thrill of success, as though you have caught more than food, as though you've captured proof that life still moves beneath all this stillness. Fishing through the ice was not for the faint-hearted. The water's edge could split suddenly, swallowing tools, or worse, a person. There are stories of whole sleds disappearing into hidden cracks. Letters from early traders along the Hudson describe men roped together when crossing rivers, each trusting the next not to panic. It sounds dramatic now, but at the time it was common sense. The land had rules that demanded obedience, not bravery. The frozen forests around you have changed too. The trees no longer sway, they shudder. Every sound carries farther, amplified by the cold. You walk carefully, breath sharp in your throat, and listen to the strange music of winter, the groan of distant ice, the dry rattle of bare branches, the faraway call of a raven cutting across the air. The woods feel both empty and alive. As you move deeper among the trees, you find the old line of animal traps you set weeks ago. The snow has half buried them, and your hands sting as you clear the drifts. The traps are primitive, little more than wooden frames and stones balanced with care. You crouch low, inspecting them one by one. In the third, a rabbit lies still, its fur dusted with frost. You take it gently, whispering an apology out of habit. Frontier people often spoke to the animals they killed, not out of superstition but respect. Life was rare enough that it deserved acknowledgement, even in death. Curiously, some settlers hung small tokens near their traps, bits of ribbon, polished stones, or scraps of cloth. Folklorists later suggested these might have been charms for luck, though others believe they simply marked the traps for easy finding. Either way, they reflect something deeper, a quiet understanding that the wilderness demanded humility. People might set the traps, but the forest decided whether to reward them. You sling the rabbit over your shoulder and continue, watching your breath trail behind you like smoke. The frozen air seems to hum faintly around your ears. The sound is constant, a low, vibrating note that feels like the world itself breathing. Old journals from early fur traders often mention this phenomenon, describing it as the voice of frost. Scientists today would call it the movement of ice under stress, but to those who lived here, it felt supernatural, as if the land were alive and restless. When you finally return to the river, the sky has begun to dim. The setting sun paints the horizon in pink and violet, the light catching on the surface of the ice until it gleams like glass. You take one last step onto it, listening again to the deep, rumbling echoes below. Each vibration feels like a reminder that the boundary between safety and disaster is paper thin. You make your way back toward the cabin slowly, the rabbit swinging lightly against your back, the air sharp in your lungs. The path is marked only by your own footprints, already half covered by new snow. You follow them carefully, guided by memory and instinct. The wind carries the faint scent of pine smoke from your chimney. Home feels close, but out here even distance can be deceiving. Inside, you light the lantern and hang your coat near the fire. The warmth spreads through your bones. You skin the rabbit carefully, working with practiced precision. The meat will be thin but nourishing, and every bite will matter. You add it to a pot with a few dried vegetables and water, letting it simmer while the smell fills the cabin. You sit near the hearth and listen again. Outside, the world creaks and groans like an enormous living body. The ice shifts, trees crack, wind sighs. Each sound feels ancient, as if the earth itself is whispering reminders of how small and temporary human life truly is. A trader's diary once described winter nights as the season when even silence has a voice. You understand that now. You glance toward the window and see the moonlight shimmering on the frozen river, a silver vein cutting through the dark forest. For a moment, you think of all the travelers who crossed that ice before you, trappers, wanderers, hunters, and dreamers, each trusting that the frozen water would carry them safely. Some made it. Some did not. You close your eyes, listening to the faint groaning from the river in the distance. It sounds like memory itself, shifting beneath the weight of time. In this strange, frozen stillness, you feel both alone and connected to something vast, something that remembers long before you and will continue long after. The fire pops once, sharp and bright, pulling you back. The stew bubbles softly, the smell rich and comforting. You take a breath, long and steady, and the tension leaves your shoulders. Outside, the ice keeps singing. Inside, you answer it with warmth and patience. Both are songs of endurance, each in their own way. Morning arrives in a dim hush, the kind of cold that feels older than memory. You open the cabin door and step into air so sharp it makes your eyes water. Frost glitters on every branch, turning the forest into a cathedral of glass. Your breath drifts upward in slow silver ribbons. The world feels both still and waiting, as if holding its breath. The snow is too deep for easy hunting, yet you have no choice. Supplies are low, and the salted meat you worked so hard to preserve is nearly gone. Today, you will have to rely on whatever small game the forest decides to offer. The big animals have vanished into the wilderness. Deer and elk have migrated south, where the wind is softer and food is easier to find. Bears sleep deep in their dens, and even wolves travel farther from human scent. What remains are the quiet survivors of the frozen world: rabbits, squirrels, and birds that cling to life in the bare trees. You pull on your snowshoes, sling your old musket across your back, and step carefully into the drifts. Your breath fogs the air with each slow exhale. Snow muffles sound so completely that your footsteps seem to vanish. The only noise comes from the creak of the leather bindings on your snowshoes and the distant tapping of a woodpecker searching for food. The silence feels strange at first, but soon it becomes part of your rhythm. You begin to listen differently, your senses sharpening. Every whisper of movement could mean a meal. Small game hunting in winter was a delicate art. Traps were often more reliable than bullets, and patience mattered more than strength. You find a hollow near a fallen log and check one of your snares. The loop of wire lies half buried in snow, untouched. You reset it and move on, feeling the numbness spreading slowly through your fingers despite the gloves. Historians have long noted how crucial small animals were to winter diets. Without them, starvation would have claimed far more settlers. One scholar called the rabbit the unsung hero of the American frontier. It was easy to underestimate the simple act of catching one, but when snow-blocked travel and grain stores ran low, that single rabbit could mean another week of life. You spot movement ahead, a flicker of brown against white. You crouch low, heart quickening. The rabbit freezes, ears sharp, eyes reflecting light like tiny mirrors. For a moment, the two of you are statues, each studying the other. Then instinct moves faster than thought. You raise your musket, exhale slowly, and fire. The sound cracks across the forest, scattering a few startled birds. When the smoke clears, the rabbit lies still. You walk toward it, the smell of black powder mingling with the clean scent of snow. You kneel beside the animal, feeling a flicker of sorrow that you do not try to hide. On the frontier, hunting was never just about necessity. It was a conversation with the land, one that demanded both respect and regret. Many settlers followed small rituals before or after a hunt. Some whispered a short prayer, some touched the earth beside the fallen creature, and others simply bowed their heads in silence. These gestures, rarely written about in formal histories, revealed a deeper understanding. To take life from the wilderness was to owe something in return. There were moments of strange beauty, too. The bright flash of a red cardinal against the snow. The way rabbit tracks zigzag across open fields, playful even in peril. The soft hoot of an owl echoing through the trees at dusk. Travelers often wrote about how such sights reminded them that the world still held wonder, even when hunger pressed hard. You sling the rabbit gently into your pack and keep walking. The sky has turned pale gold, the sun weak but beautiful. You follow a line of animal tracks down to a stream half covered by ice. The sound of trickling water feels almost like a voice. You kneel, break a thin layer of ice with your hand, and drink. The water is shockingly cold, biting at your teeth, but it clears your head. For a moment, you feel a strange gratitude that even this small act is possible. Not every settler could hunt, and many depended on trapping birds instead. Nets made from hemp or horsehair were stretched between trees, baited with seeds. Quails, doves, and even crows sometimes filled the empty pots. One odd account tells of a family surviving an entire February on nothing but roasted sparrows. The letter describing it ends with the line, "We ate like kings." Perhaps it was meant as humor, or perhaps exhaustion had replaced despair with irony. By late afternoon, the light begins to fade again. You head back toward the cabin, carrying 2 rabbits and a squirrel, a modest but hard-earned reward. The snow crunches beneath your boots, the trees now glowing pink in the sunset. In that fading light, the forest looks both fragile and eternal. You imagine the countless generations of people who walked through this same silence, chasing the same flickers of movement, depending on the same uncertain mercy of nature. Back inside, the fire welcomes you with its golden breath. You skin the rabbits carefully, working slowly, trying not to waste a single scrap. The smell of raw meat mixes with the smoke, earthy and sharp. You drop the bones into a pot, add snow for water, and watch it melt into a thin, steaming broth. The first sip burns your tongue but tastes of victory, simple and profound. You lean back, feeling the warmth seep through your layers of wool. Outside, the stars begin to appear, bright and endless above the white forest. Somewhere far away, a fox cries out, its voice lonely but sure. You think of it not as an enemy but as another soul trying to live through the same winter. Out here, everything alive shares that single purpose. The fire crackles softly as you close your eyes. The taste of the broth lingers, smoky and rich. Tomorrow you will rise again, step into the snow, and listen for the faint, hidden sounds of life beneath the silence. The frontier does not offer comfort easily, but it rewards patience with moments of grace. Tonight, that is enough. Night stretches long and heavy, and the forest has gone quiet again. The day's hunt is done. The traps are checked, and now there is nothing left but time and the steady rhythm of the fire. You sit by the hearth, the orange light painting slow patterns across the rough cabin walls. Outside, the cold deepens, thick and relentless, pressing against every chink of wood and clay. Inside, the only movement is the lazy rise and fall of smoke curling toward the rafters. This is how most frontier nights pass, not with adventure, but with waiting. In these hours of darkness, work shifts into quieter forms. Hands that swung axes or rifles now turn to smaller tasks. You reach for a piece of leather to mend your boots, the needle biting through the thick hide. The sound is soft, almost meditative. The faint scrape of thread, the sigh of fabric, the whisper of fire. Every motion has its rhythm. For a moment, the simple act of sewing feels like the only thing tethering you to sanity. Most frontier families lived for these candlelit evenings. The day's chores left their bodies exhausted but their minds restless. So they turned to the small rituals that made the dark less oppressive: mending clothes, carving handles for tools, reading from worn Bibles, or just staring into the flames while the clock ticked slowly forward. A settler's journal from 1810 records that the silence of night is both enemy and friend. It tests the heart but teaches the soul. That sentiment has endured across centuries because it was true for nearly everyone who faced the long winters. On the table beside you, a candle burns steadily, its flame trembling each time the wind presses against the walls. You can smell the faint sweetness of tallow mixed with smoke, a scent that clings to everything. Wax candles were rare luxuries, saved for births, weddings, and funerals. Most nights were lit by animal fat candles that hissed quietly and smoked black against the ceiling. One curious account describes settlers flavoring the tallow with cinnamon or spruce sap when they could, not for comfort but to mask the sour smell. Historians later noted that such improvisations were small acts of dignity, proof that even hardship could not strip away the human desire for grace. You turn another page in a small, tattered book beside the fire. The paper crackles as you move it, and the ink has faded from years of handling. Reading on the frontier was more than pastime. It was a form of escape. Books were scarce, often passed from one cabin to another until the covers fell apart. A single copy of Pilgrim's Progress or Gulliver's Travels might circulate through an entire valley. Families read aloud together, their voices blending with the sound of the fire, the words stretching across generations. Your own book is a simple almanac, full of weather notes and moral sayings, but the familiarity of its words comforts you. You trace a line with your finger, reading softly to yourself. The dog's ears twitch at the sound of your voice. In a world where days are ruled by labor and danger, these quiet hours become something sacred. Sometimes, when the cold feels endless, you carve. You pick up a small block of pine, and your knife, its handle worn smooth by use. The shavings fall to the floor in soft curls that smell of resin and warmth. You carve without a plan, letting the wood decide what shape it wants to take. Perhaps a bird, perhaps a face. The rhythm of cutting and smoothing fills the silence in a way words never could. Travelers once wrote that the sound of a knife against wood was as common on the frontier as birdsong in summer. It was the music of survival. Not everyone handled these long nights so calmly. Diaries from the time speak of restlessness that grew into unease, even dread. Some settlers began to imagine things in the flickering firelight, faces forming in the shadows, whispers rising from the corners. Psychologists today might call it sensory deprivation, but the people then called it the cabin fever. It was a slow unraveling of patience, a test of how long one could bear silence before it turned into noise. To fight it, families told stories. You can imagine them gathered close, bundled under blankets, the children's eyes wide as their parents spun tales of distant lands or ghostly wanderers in the snow. Each story served two purposes: to pass the time and to remind everyone that imagination still lived, even when the world outside seemed dead. One letter from a Massachusetts settler describes her husband telling stories till our shadows danced on the wall as if we had company. You reach for your cup, the last of your tea cooled to a faint warmth. The candle has burned low, its flame small and steady. The room smells of smoke, leather, and old wood. The dog snores softly by the fire. The crackling of the logs becomes the only sound left, steady as a heartbeat. You think about how strange it is that comfort in such isolation comes from repetition, the same meal, the same chores, the same nightly rituals. The predictability becomes a shield against despair. In a way, these quiet, ordinary moments are what truly define frontier life. Not the battles against nature, but the small acts that make endurance possible. Outside, the moon rises, washing the world in silver light. You glance through the window and see snow sparkling under the trees, untouched and endless. Inside, the fire glows low, painting everything in amber. The two worlds, one frozen, one alive, touch at the edge of the glass. You sit still, letting the warmth sink into your bones, the calm into your mind. The candle flickers once more, before dying completely, leaving only the dim light of the fire. You close your eyes, feeling the rhythm of the flames, the softness of the air, and the faint pulse of life that continues quietly, stubbornly, in this frozen wilderness. Tomorrow will come, and the silence will return, but tonight the quiet feels gentle, almost kind. When you wake, the light is dim and strange. The window glows with a dull grey sheen, and a sound like soft sighing drifts from outside. You push aside the blanket and feel a chill that cuts to the bone. The fire has gone out again, and the air inside the cabin bites your skin. You rise slowly, every step heavy, and open the door to find the world buried under white. The storm has come. Snow falls in thick sheets, each flake large as a coin. The wind curls through the trees with a low, mournful sound, carrying fine powder that stings your eyes. The sky has vanished, replaced by a shifting wall of grey. You can hardly see the fence posts 10 steps from your door. The storm's breath fills the air, and it feels as though the world itself is shrinking. You shut the door quickly and brace it with the wooden bar. The cabin shudders slightly, as if alive. Blizzards like this defined the frontier winter. They arrived without warning and stayed for days, sometimes longer. Snow piled as high as rooftops, burying barns, blocking doors and sealing windows shut. Many families survived only because they had prepared for such moments. Their firewood stacked high, their barrels full. Yet even the best preparation could fail when nature decided to remind humanity who ruled here. You kneel by the hearth and work to revive the fire, blowing carefully until a small orange glow appears. Smoke rises, thin and blue, filling the air with its familiar smell. The warmth builds slowly, but it cannot fight the draft that slips through every crack. You wrap yourself in a heavy coat and sit close to the flames, listening to the storm's howl. The sound is deep and endless, a kind of music that vibrates in your chest. Old journals describe these storms in tones both fearful and reverent. One Vermont farmer wrote that the blizzard roared like a beast that would not sleep. Another, from the Wisconsin frontier, described how the wind carried voices that seemed to whisper at the edges of hearing. Some thought it was the sound of the trees bending. Others said it was the dead speaking through the snow. Folklorists still discuss whether those accounts were poetic exaggerations or fragments of truth shaped by exhaustion and fear. You spend the first hours tending the fire and checking the cabin's walls. The wood creaks and moans as the wind pushes against it. The shutters rattle like loose teeth. Every so often, snow slips from the roof with a muffled thud. It is strange how sound changes during a storm. Everything outside is distant, blurred, while inside each noise feels magnified, close enough to touch. By afternoon you try to keep busy. You stir the pot over the hearth, adding the last of the vegetables and a bit of dried meat. The scent fills the air, rich and smoky, but the taste will never match the comfort it promises. Hunger dulls the mind, but boredom can cut deeper. You patch the corner of a blanket, sharpen your knife, sweep the floor again. There is nothing else to do but wait. Time loses meaning when you are trapped by snow. The light outside shifts so subtly that you cannot tell if it is morning or evening. The storm erases the horizon and replaces it with an unending greyness. You light another candle, watching its flame flicker in the draught. Each moment stretches until it feels like an hour. The mind begins to wander, playing tricks in the silence between gusts of wind. In the middle of the night, the cabin groans loudly, snapping you awake. The snow piled against one wall has grown heavy, and the logs strain under its weight. You throw on your boots, grab a shovel, and push open the door with effort. A wall of white greets you. The snow nearly reaches your shoulders. You dig slowly, breath steaming, each movement a battle against the wind. The air tastes sharp, filled with tiny crystals that sting your lips. You work until your muscles burn, clearing just enough space to keep the doorway free. Then you stand for a moment, the storm swirling around you, the snow biting at your face. The sound of the wind fills your ears completely. It feels endless, like standing inside a living ocean. For a brief instant, you understand why some settlers called these storms white prisons. The cold has no malice, but it holds everything captive. You return to the cabin and collapse by the fire, shaking with exhaustion. The flames seem brighter now, almost golden. You hold your hands toward them, feeling the warmth creep back into your skin. Every heartbeat feels heavy but alive. The dog lifts its head, yawns, and curls closer to you. Its quiet presence steadies your mind. To pass the hours, you hum softly, an old tune you barely remember. The melody fills the room, mingling with the rhythm of the storm outside. It is strange how sound becomes a lifeline in such moments. Even a voice, however small, reminds you that the silence cannot have you completely. You think of the countless others who sat through nights like this, families in one-room cabins, travelers in snow-covered wagons, shepherds trapped with their flocks. Many of them wrote later that the hardest part was not fear, but the waiting. You cannot fight a blizzard. You can only endure it. By morning, the storm finally begins to weaken. The wind fades to a whisper, and light filters through the small cracks in the shutter. You step outside to find the world transformed. The snow glows blue in the early light, smooth and perfect, as though the land has been reborn. Every sound seems distant again, swallowed by the vastness of white. You breathe deeply, filling your lungs with cold air that feels almost pure. The storm has passed, and the cabin still stands. You have survived one more trial of the winter. In the quiet aftermath, the world feels gentle again, though you know it is only resting before the next test. Inside, you feed the fire one more log and watch the flames rise. They dance brightly, defiant against the chill. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the silence after the storm. It feels clean, almost forgiving. The long night is over. The storm has left the land silent again, but not empty. You step outside into a morning that feels freshly made. The air is bright and sharp, sunlight glinting on snow so pure it almost hurts your eyes. The cold still clings to your coat, but the world looks softer now, as if the violence of the blizzard never happened. For a few breaths, the peace feels complete. Then, as often happens after great hardship, your thoughts turn inward. You start to wonder what keeps a person steady through so much uncertainty. Faith, of one kind or another, filled that role for many on the frontier. When nature could not be reasoned with, belief offered a kind of structure to the chaos. You imagine yourself sitting by the fire that evening, hands clasped, whispering words that rise and vanish with the smoke. Out here, there are no churches, no bells, no polished pews. The frontier altar is the hearth, and the sermon is the wind itself. Some settlers carried small Bibles in their coat pockets, their pages stained with smoke and fingerprints. Others made simple crosses from twigs or carved verses into the handles of their tools. One farmer in Pennsylvania wrote that he kept a psalm etched into his shovel because a man should carry hope where he works. That quiet image says more about the human spirit than 100 grand cathedrals. But not all faith took a single form. For every settler who prayed to a distant god, another turned to small rituals that gave comfort when logic failed. A pinch of salt tossed into the fire to ward off bad luck. A candle left burning to keep away restless spirits. A charm sewn into a child's coat for protection. Many of these customs came from old-world folklore mixed with native traditions, blending into something uniquely American. Historians often puzzle over how much of it was superstition and how much was survival instinct disguised as ritual. You sit by the fire that night, the glow flickering over the walls, and feel the familiar tug of habit. You whisper a few words, not a prayer exactly, but a quiet acknowledgement of gratitude. The act itself is enough. In this vast wilderness, faith does not need structure or certainty, it only needs sincerity. Loneliness has a way of making belief both fragile and fierce. When days stretch without end and nights seem to last forever, people look for meaning in whatever they can. A red sunrise might become a sign of hope. The sudden silence of the forest could feel like an omen. One settler's diary describes a family who believed the creaking of their cabin beams at night were the voices of angels testing the wood. Whether metaphor or madness, such thoughts carried them through another winter. A few frontier communities gathered for worship when the weather allowed, walking miles through snow to reach a neighbor's cabin. They sang hymns until their breath fogged the air, voices trembling from both devotion and cold. A visiting preacher might arrive once or twice a year, his sermons lasting hours as candles flickered and children slept under quilts. One letter from the 1820 tells of a preacher who walked 40 miles through a blizzard to deliver communion to a single family. Some called it foolishness. Others called it proof of divine will. Scholars still discuss how such acts blurred the line between faith and sheer stubbornness. Yet faith on the frontier was not always solemn. It could also be playful, a shared superstition to keep fear away. Some families left a loaf of bread on the windowsill during heavy snow, so that wandering spirits would eat and move along. Others refused to whistle indoors in winter, believing it might call the wind inside. Even laughter itself became a kind of protection, a way to remind the mind that warmth still existed in the world. You think of all those small acts as you stare into the fire. The flames dance in patterns that feel almost purposeful, like a language older than words. Perhaps faith is not about what you believe, but how you keep believing. In a place where the world can freeze overnight, hope becomes as necessary as firewood. There were darker beliefs too. Some spoke of ghost lights over frozen fields, souls of travelers who never made it home. Others told stories of witches who could turn the snow against a man or steal warmth from a hearth. Whether real or imagined, such tales gave shape to fear, and sometimes naming a fear is the first step in surviving it. Folklorists have long wondered why these stories persisted, but anyone who has lived through a silent winter night knows why. When the wind howls for hours and the dark feels endless, the mind fills it with meaning. As you sit quietly, you take a small coal from the fire with a pair of tongs and drop it into a bowl of water. The hiss is sharp and brief. Some frontier families did this every night before bed, believing it drove sickness from the home. You know it is only habit, but it comforts you anyway. The act feels like an unspoken promise to wake again in the morning. The night deepens, the wind has settled, but you can still hear the faint creak of the frozen trees outside. The room glows softly, the fire's light trembling over your hands. You feel both very small and strangely strong. Faith, whether in God, luck, or simple persistence, has become the invisible thread that binds you to the living world. You whisper one last word to the quiet room before lying down. The meaning hardly matters. What matters is the sound, the breath that proves you are still here. The fire fades to embers. The air cools. Outside, the moon climbs above the forest, casting silver light over the snow. The storm is forgotten, but the faith it stirred remains, quiet and steady, like a pulse beneath the frozen earth. The days shorten further, and the air outside grows so sharp it almost hums. You wake before dawn to the sound of frost cracking on the window pane. The fire has gone out again, leaving the cabin dim and silent. You reach for the flint and steel and coax a spark back into being. The flame rises slowly, catching on the kindling, then climbs into steady warmth. That fragile bloom of light feels like relief, but not only because of the cold. It means there will be warmth enough for two. Behind you, the quiet rustle of movement comes from beneath the quilts. Your companion stirs, pulling the blanket closer around their shoulders, the faintest sigh escaping their lips. On the frontier, affection rarely looked like what poets described. It was not flowers or courtship. It was shared labor, shared warmth, shared silence. Survival forged closeness faster than time ever could. You turn toward them and smile, the kind that needs no words. Winter has a way of shrinking the world until all that matters fits within a single room. Couples, families, even strangers thrown together by circumstance learned this truth quickly. The small cabin becomes a universe of glances, gestures, and patience. When storms raged for days, people had to find ways to live not just beside each other, but with each other. Letters from settlers often reveal this quiet intimacy. One woman wrote to her sister that she never loved him so well as when he carried in the wood without my asking. Another man described his wife mending his coat by the light of the fire, her hair catching sparks of orange, and how that sight felt warmer than the fire itself. Such moments were ordinary, yet they stitched lives together more tightly than any ceremony. Still, winter tested even the strongest bonds. Isolation magnified small irritations until they echoed in the air. Arguments over trivial things, a misplaced tool, a forgotten chore, a half-empty barrel could flare and fade within minutes, leaving a silence heavy with regret. One diary tells of a woman who began talking to her husband only through their dog after 3 weeks of snow. The entry ends with a line half joking, half serious. "The dog is the best diplomat we have." Historians smile at such details, but anyone who has endured months of confinement would understand perfectly. There was tenderness, too, of the simplest kind. The gentle act of brushing snow from another's coat, the sharing of a cup of broth, the warmth of two hands meeting in the dark when words have run out. These gestures carried more comfort than entire conversations. On the coldest nights, couples slept pressed together, breath mingling, heat shared through layers of wool and fatigue. Love on the frontier was quiet but unbreakable, made not of promises but of presence. You sit beside your companion now, both of you wrapped in the same blanket watching the fire. The silence feels companionable. You can smell the faint sweetness of the burning wood and hear the low hum of the wind outside. Their hand finds yours, rough from work but warm. For a moment, the world outside ceases to matter. Even in such closeness, there was always risk. Childbirth in winter was perilous, often carried out by candlelight and prayer. Neighbors might arrive too late, or not at all. Yet there are countless stories of resilience. Women delivering babies alone, fathers heating water, and cutting swaddling cloth with trembling hands. One frontier midwife wrote in her worn notebook that, "A new cry in a snowstorm is the sound of hope itself." That line feels true in your bones, even now. Not all affection was between couples. Families depended on one another, bound by necessity and affection alike. Children brought laughter into the long nights. Friends became kin. Neighbors who shared supplies or news during blizzards often forged bonds deeper than blood. Sociologists today note that these small, cooperative networks may have been the only reason entire settlements survived the harshest years. Frontier love, in all its forms, was practical, patient, and enduring. You look across the room and notice a small carving on the table, a bird whittled from pine during one of those endless nights. Its wings are uneven, but it carries a quiet grace. Your companion had made it weeks ago, perhaps without knowing why. Now, it seems like a message carved in silence. Beauty can still exist where life is hardest. The wind outside rises again, brushing against the cabin walls. Snowflakes drift past the window like falling ash. You rest your head on their shoulder and feel their steady breathing. The firelight flickers on your joined hands. It feels fragile, this warmth, but real enough to last through another storm. A letter from an old preacher once described love on the frontier as the hearth of the soul in a world of cold. You think about that as the night deepens. Affection here is not loud or dramatic. It is the soft steadiness that holds life together when everything else is frozen. It is a shared blanket, a shared silence, a shared belief that morning will come. You close your eyes and listen to the rhythm of two heartbeats blending with the sound of wind. The world outside is still and wide, but inside this small room there is warmth, light, and a quiet kind of grace. For now, that is all the frontier ever promised, and all that you need. The next morning breaks in a pale blue haze. You open your eyes to the thin light seeping through frost-streaked glass and the faint creak of timbers settling. The cabin feels quieter than usual. Outside, the snow has stopped falling, and the world lies still as if caught in a single frozen breath. You hear laughter, high and bright, cutting through the silence. Children are awake. You step to the door and open it carefully. The cold rushes in, biting at your cheeks, but the sound that greets you feels alive. A few children from nearby homesteads are playing on the frozen pond, bundled in layers of wool and hide, their faces red with joy. They glide awkwardly across the ice, using sticks for balance. The air fills with the scrape of boots, the ring of laughter, and the occasional sharp crack of breaking frost. It is a melody that warms the cold morning. Frontier children grew up close to hardship, but they found their own worlds within it. Their games were built from the materials of survival. Sticks became horses, lumps of snow became forts, and patches of ice became places of wonder. Diaries from the late 1700s and early 1800s often mention that children took the cold better than adults, as if they had not yet learned to fear it. One mother in New York wrote that her sons played till their mittens froze stiff, then laughed while I thawed them by the fire. You watch them from the edge of the pond, remembering how childhood always seems brighter in memory, even when the air could kill with its chill. The little ones chase each other in circles, their voices carrying across the stillness. A girl falls, then laughs so hard she forgets to cry. Another kneels beside her, brushing snow from her coat with small, serious hands. Even in the depths of the harshest winter, kindness thrives most easily among the young. Small joys like these gave families reason to endure. After chores were finished, children helped their parents with whatever tasks they could manage, feeding animals, hauling kindling, or stirring soup. Yet they also brought imagination to the dark months. In some cabins, they would draw with charcoal on the walls or carve tiny animals from scraps of wood. One old letter mentions a boy who made a toy family out of corn husks and gave them their own fire built from pebbles. The writer called it a small reminder that play, too, is a kind of prayer. As you watch the children slide and stumble on the ice, you think of how little separated wonder from danger. Frozen ponds could crack without warning. Snowdrifts could swallow a child in seconds. Parents lived with quiet fear behind every laugh. One journal tells of a mother who tied bright ribbons to her children's coats before letting them play outside so she could see them against the snow. That small, heartbreaking precaution says everything about what it meant to love someone in a land that could so easily take them away. By noon, the laughter fades as the children return to their homes. Smoke begins to rise again from scattered chimneys, grey against the white sky. You walk back to your cabin and warm your hands near the fire. The room smells faintly of broth and smoke. Your companion hums softly as they mend a torn mitten, and you feel the comfortable quiet that follows good noise. Frontier winters shape childhood differently from anything known in the towns and cities back east. There were no schools for months at a time, no neighbors close enough for easy play. Learning came from watching how to chop wood, how to read tracks, how to listen for the tone of the wind that signaled a storm. Children grew into responsibility quickly, but they carried an optimism their parents sometimes lost. A curious passage from a traveler's diary tells of visiting a cabin during a blizzard and finding the children teaching the adults a new game involving carved dice. The adults had been listless for days, but the laughter returned with the sound of rolling wood on the table. The traveler wrote, "They brought the sun into the room without a match." Folklorists who later studied these accounts often concluded that play was not just recreation but emotional survival. In the evenings, when chores were done, families often gathered around the fire to tell stories. Some were moral tales, others old legends from across the ocean, and some were born right there on the frontier. Children listened with wide eyes as their parents spoke of glowing lights over frozen lakes or hunters who turned into stars. These stories, told night after night, shaped a shared imagination that outlasted hunger, cold, and fear. You sit now by the fire, hearing echoes of such stories in your mind. Outside, the pond has fallen silent again, its surface smooth under the pale moon. You picture those small figures laughing in the cold, unaware of how precious that sound is to anyone listening. The innocence of their play feels like defiance, a reminder that life can still be light-hearted, even when the world has hardened around it. You take a slow breath and let the warmth of the fire settle into your chest. Tomorrow, the children will return to their chores and lessons in endurance. But tonight, their laughter lingers in the air, weaving through the smoke and the memory of the frozen morning. In a land that often demanded silence, their joy was the only music that mattered. Night comes early now, folding itself gently over the land. The light fades slowly through shades of violet and ash until the snow glows blue in the moonlight. Inside, the fire burns low and steady, filling the room with that slow rhythm that has become the pulse of your winter life. The day's work is finished, the traps are checked, the animals fed, the children quiet. There is nothing left to do but sit near the hearth and let the silence speak. Then you hear it, a faint sound, not from outside but within the cabin itself, a low humming, soft and uncertain. You turn to see your companion at the table, carving a piece of wood into the shape of a fiddle. The motion is careful, reverent almost, as though the sound it will one day make already exists in the room. Music, you realize, is the one luxury the wilderness cannot deny. Few things carried people through the frontier winter like music and memory. Even in the harshest months, settlers found ways to fill the silence with sound. Fiddles, flutes, harmonicas, and homemade whistles, all instruments carved or improvised by hand. A visitor to an early settlement in Ohio wrote that on Sunday evenings, the cabins glowed with song more than with light. The melodies were simple folk tunes brought from Scotland, hymns from New England, ballads from Germany, but they wove comfort into the long nights like thread through fabric. You watch as the carving continues, the knife glinting softly in the candlelight. The sound of wood scraping is gentle, rhythmic, almost musical in itself. Later, the half-finished fiddle will be strung with horsehair from a brush and resin scraped from pine. The tone will be rough and uneven, but the first note that rises will feel like a miracle. When night deepens, you find the old tin whistle tucked on the mantel. You raise it to your lips and blow softly. The tune that comes out is imperfect, a fragment of something older than memory. It wavers at first, then steadies, floating through the cabin. The sound fills the space between the logs, brushing against the ceiling beams, curling into the corners where shadows linger. Music carried memory on the frontier. Each melody was a reminder of places far away, a church bell from a lost town, the laughter of a market square, a voice once loved. One settler wrote that a fiddle could warm the heart when even firewood failed. Another described his father playing for hours during blizzards, the children falling asleep by the hearth as the storm howled outside. Historians say that these musical nights helped keep families sane through isolation. But to the people living it, it was simpler. Song was proof that life still had color. You play until your breath runs thin, the tune drifts into quiet, and the silence that follows feels softer, changed somehow. The fire crackles in agreement, as if approving. Your companion looks up, smiles faintly, and begins humming another melody. The notes blend, overlapping, filling the room with warmth that has nothing to do with heat. Outside, the world remains frozen, but in here, sound moves like smoke, curling upward, carrying the weight of longing and peace. Even the dog lifts its head, tail thumping lazily, lulled by the gentle rise and fall. In many settlements, music was the center of winter gatherings. Neighbors would brave the snow to visit, carrying lanterns that flickered like fireflies in the dark. Inside one cabin, boots stomped rhythm on the floor while fiddles and pipes sang. The room would shake with laughter and clapping until the roof beams dripped with condensation. Then, when exhaustion set in, the songs turned slow and mournful old ballads of lost homes and faraway families. Anthropologists later called these songs the echo of exile, melodies shaped by longing and survival. One peculiar story tells of a man who carved flutes from the bones of deer he had hunted, believing their spirits lived through the sound. Whether it was art or reverence, no one could say. The neighbors thought him strange, but when he played at night, even the dogs went quiet to listen. The blend of practicality and mysticism ran deep in these lives, and music often sat right between the two. You sit by the fire again, the whistle resting in your lap, and close your eyes. The tune still lingers in your head, looping gently like the rhythm of a heartbeat. Every winter note seems to hold a piece of something larger, a promise, a memory, a dream of spring. You understand now why the settlers sang even when no one was there to listen. Sound was a way to remind themselves that silence did not own them. You glance at the small shelf by the wall where a few personal treasures rest. A wooden cup, a folded letter, a shell from a river far away. Each carries its own music, though you cannot hear it. The letter crackles faintly when moved. The cup hums softly when filled. The shell echoes the faintest whisper of water when held to your ear. These quiet harmonies shape your nights more than any grand tune ever could. As the candle burns low, you hum one last melody, a lullaby your mother might have sung, though the words have long been lost. The notes drift softly through the cabin, tender and slow. The firelight flickers across the walls like moving stars. You feel the weight of the day lift from your shoulders. Outside, the frozen forest listens in silence. Inside, you hold the last song of the night in your breath, letting it fade into stillness. When the final note slips away, the room feels full instead of empty. The quiet has changed. It no longer feels like absence but like rest. The frontier sleeps, the world breathes, and you are part of its rhythm, warm and alive in the long winter night. The days have blended into one another now, their boundaries softened by snow and repetition. You can no longer tell whether it is Tuesday or Sunday, only that the air feels heavier and the sun seems to linger lower on the horizon each morning. The world has shrunk again to the size of your cabin and the forest beyond it. Then, one afternoon, the quiet breaks. A sound comes from the wood's hooves crunching through snow, a shout, and the distant jingle of metal. You step outside, heart quickening, and see a rider approaching along the frozen path. His coat is dusted with frost, his horse breathing clouds of steam. Slung across his back is a leather satchel sealed with wax. A messenger. In the early frontier, letters were a miracle. They arrived rarely, carried by traders, trappers, or soldiers traveling between settlements. Months might pass before any word from the world beyond reached your door. When it did, it was like hearing a voice from another planet. You wave to the rider as he dismounts, his boots sinking deep into the snow. He greets you briefly, too tired for conversation, and pulls a small bundle from his satchel. Inside are 2 letters tied with string, one for you and one for your neighbor miles downriver. Your hands tremble slightly as you hold the envelope. The paper feels thin, fragile as dried leaves. You can smell faint traces of smoke and ink, as though the letter has absorbed the scent of its long journey. You take it inside and sit near the fire, staring at the name written across the front in careful script. It is from your sister, written months ago, before the river froze. When you open it, the room grows quiet again, as if listening. Her words spill out in neat lines, describing a world that feels impossibly distant. The market in town, the harvest, the chatter of neighbors. She writes of family gatherings by firelight, of laughter, of a baby born and named for your late mother. She sends prayers and well wishes and hopes you have enough wood to last the winter. There is a pressed violet folded inside, brittle but still faintly purple. For a moment, you feel as though spring itself has reached into your frozen room. Letters like this carried warmth that even the best fire could not give. They reminded settlers that they were still part of a wider world, still remembered. A farmer in the Illinois Territory once wrote that a letter from home was as dear as the sight of sun after a storm. Scholars later noted that these written connections formed the emotional lifelines of frontier life. Words had to travel across hundreds of miles of snow, mud, and silence to arrive in trembling hands. You set the letter on the table, smoothing the creases with your palm. The ink has faded slightly, but her handwriting remains clear, elegant, alive. The simple act of reading becomes a ritual. Each sentence you whisper aloud, each pause feels like a shared breath across time. For a few minutes, the cabin fills with the sound of another voice. Not every letter brought comfort. Some carried sorrow. Families received news of sickness, of lost ships, of wars far away. One tragic note preserved in a museum tells of a man who learned of his brother's death nearly a year after it happened. The writer apologized for the delay, explaining that the river routes had frozen early. The letter ends with a line that still catches the heart. We buried him in the thaw. You sit quietly, tracing the edges of the violet. Outside, the world is still white and endless, but inside you feel tethered again. Someone thought of you, wrote to you, and that thought crossed forests, rivers, and storms to reach your small wooden home. It is enough to make the loneliness ease for a while. Later that evening, you take out a small scrap of paper and dip your pen in the last of your ink. The words come slowly at first, hesitant. You write of the snow, of the storms, of the fire that never quite warms enough. You describe the sound of the river freezing and the strange beauty of the moonlight on the trees. You thank your sister for her letter, for the flower, for remembering. When you finish, you fold the paper carefully and seal it with a bit of wax from a candle. It will wait by the door until someone passes through again, maybe next week, maybe next month. In this frozen world, communication is measured not in speed but in hope. Before you sleep, you read her letter one more time by the flickering light. The words seem to glow softly, as if carrying a warmth that ink alone could not contain. You tuck it into a small wooden box beside the hearth, next to other letters, tiny treasures of connection in a vast, indifferent land. Outside, the snow begins to fall again, covering the rider's tracks until they vanish completely. But inside, your world feels wider now, your heart less heavy. For the first time in weeks, the cabin feels full of voices. The words linger long after you lie down, wrapping you in memory and belonging. Somewhere, far away, someone might be reading your letter too, by another fire, under the same cold sky. The next morning begins with a low hunger that gnaws at your belly before you even open your eyes. You sit up slowly, the blanket heavy with frost along the edges, and listen to the faint hiss of wind outside. The cabin smells of wood smoke and old broth, but the pot hanging over the hearth is empty. The fire has burned down to a small glow, barely alive. You realize with a small dread that the food stores are nearly gone. Every frontier family faced this moment eventually. No matter how careful the planning, no matter how well stocked the cellar, winter always lasted a little longer than expected. You lift the trapdoor to check your supplies again. Inside the root cellar, shadows stretch long over shelves that look painfully bare. 2 small jars of dried beans, a handful of cornmeal, 1 turnip soft with age. The salted pork barrel stands nearly empty, its brine cloudy and cold. You close the lid quietly, as if not to wake something sleeping there. Hunger changed people on the frontier. It stripped away pride and turned survival into a kind of negotiation with the land. Families rationed portions with ruthless precision, counting out every spoonful. Meals became measured ceremonies. One diary from the winter of 1798 records a woman dividing a loaf of bread into 12 equal pieces and marking each with her initials to prevent quarrels. That kind of hunger left memories that never faded. You light the fire again and melt a pot of snow for water. The sound of it bubbling is comforting even before there is anything to cook. You add the last handful of beans and a pinch of salt, stirring slowly. The smell is thin but warm, filling the small space with something that almost feels like abundance. You sit and watch the pot, your thoughts drifting like the steam curling upward. Old letters tell of how settlers turned to strange or desperate meals when provisions ran low. Boiled bark, roasted shoe leather, broth made from whatever bones remained. One particularly curious entry from a Tennessee homestead describes a recipe for coffee brewed from toasted cornmeal and maple sap. It tasted terrible, the writer admitted, but it kept the illusion of comfort alive. Historians still argue whether that story is literal truth or frontier folklore, though the tone of the letter suggests grim honesty. You taste your thin soup carefully. It burns your tongue, but the flavor of salt and earth is enough to keep your hands from shaking. Hunger dulls after a while, replaced by a light-headed calm. You think about the people who faced winters like this before you, and wonder what kept them from giving up. Some had faith, others stubbornness, others simply no choice. One thing binds them all. They found meaning in the smallest victories, like a meal that fills the stomach even halfway. Outside, the wind carries the faint creak of the trees, a rhythm you now know by heart. You step out briefly, pulling your coat tight, and look toward the frozen woods. The snow glints pale gold under a weak Sunday. No birds move, no tracks cross the clearing. You know there will be little game now, but still you check the traps out of habit. Each is empty, crusted with frost. You reset them, whispering a quiet hope to the silence, and turn back toward the cabin. Inside, the fire pops sharply, startling you for a moment. You ladle the last of the broth into a cup and drink it slowly, letting each sip linger. The warmth spreads through your chest, a faint echo of what fullness used to feel like. For now, it is enough. Frontier hunger was not always physical. Sometimes it was the hunger for something familiar, a taste, a smell, a sound from home. Settlers wrote about missing the smell of baking bread or the crunch of fresh apples. Things so ordinary They had never thought to treasure them. One letter from a woman in the Kentucky wilderness confessed that she dreamed of the sound of my mother's spoon against the pot more than of heaven. That simple longing speaks volumes about what deprivation does to the heart. To fight the monotony of hunger, people invented flavor. They boiled pine needles for tea, dried wild herbs, or added ash to porridge for a hint of mineral taste. Some even baked ash cakes, flat rounds of cornmeal cooked directly on coals. When done right, the outer layer turned black while the inside stayed soft and sweet. You decide to try it, mixing your remaining cornmeal with snowmelt until it forms a rough dough. You pat it flat and set it carefully among the embers. The smell is sharp and smoky. When it is done, you scrape off the ash and take a bite. It is gritty, faintly sweet, strangely satisfying. You think about how the frontier redefined comfort. Luxury became a hot meal, a full fire, a day without frostbite. Even the poorest scraps could feel rich when shared. In some settlements, neighbors gathered during the leanest weeks, combining what little they had into communal stews. There is an account of one family adding a single onion to another's pot as a gesture of friendship. The writer called it a feast made from faith. You sit by the fire, licking the crumbs from your fingers, and glance at the window. Snowflakes drift lazily against the glass, catching the orange light from the hearth. The hunger has quieted for now, but the awareness of scarcity lingers. Tomorrow you will check the traps again, maybe try fishing through the ice. For tonight, you let yourself rest. Your companion stirs beside the hearth, wrapping another blanket around their shoulders. You hand them a small piece of ash cake, and they take it wordlessly, their eyes soft with gratitude. The two of you eat in silence, the firelight flickering over tired faces. Outside, the cold presses close, patient and endless. Inside, you share the last meal of the day and, for the moment, feel human again. You wake to the sound of howling far away, long and low like the mournful call of a horn. At first it blends with the wind, but soon you recognize the rhythm. Wolves. You rise slowly, your breath clouding the air as you listen. The sound drifts closer, carried across the frozen valley. It echoes between the trees, multiplied until you cannot tell if there are 3 or 30. Predators were the constant shadows of frontier life. When food ran scarce for humans, it vanished for animals too. Wolves, foxes, and sometimes bears crept near settlements in search of easy prey. The fear they brought was not always for one's own life, but for the animals that meant survival. Cows, sheep, dogs, horses. You move to the window and peer into the grey morning light. The snow beyond the fence looks untouched, but you can feel the tension in the air. You step outside, boots sinking into the drifts. The forest feels still, every sound sharper than usual. Somewhere, a crow caws once and then falls silent. You walk toward the animal pen, rifle slung over your shoulder, eyes scanning the tree line. For a long moment, nothing stirs. Then, in the distance, you catch movement shadows shifting between pines, low to the ground, quick. Your pulse quickens. Wolves on the frontier were both feared and admired. Early settlers wrote about them with a kind of grim respect. One man in Maine described them as ghosts of the snow, seen only when they choose. Another called them neighbors that test our fences. These creatures symbolized the wild that refused to be tamed, the part of nature that did not bend to human will. You find the tracks near the barn paws pressed deep into the snow, circling but not yet close. The prints are fresh. You kneel to examine them, the cold biting through your gloves. The air smells of pine and something faintly metallic, like blood carried on the wind. You stand slowly and check the latch on the pen, reassuring the trembling cow with a quiet voice. Its breath steams in the air, mingling with yours. That night, the howling begins again, closer this time. The sound crawls through the dark, winding between the cracks of the cabin walls. You stir the fire until it burns brighter and keep your rifle near. The dog lifts its head, growls once, then goes silent. The two of you wait, every nerve tuned to the smallest sound outside. Stories of wolf attacks filled early journals, though modern historians suspect most were exaggerated. Still, there are verified accounts of livestock torn apart, of travelers surrounded on the road. Some settlers claimed that wolves grew boldest on nights when the moon was brightest, drawn by hunger and curiosity alike. Others insisted that if you stared long enough into the trees, you could sometimes see their eyes shining like cold lanterns. A curious superstition arose from such nights. Families hung bits of metal old spoons, pieces of chain outside their doors to rattle in the wind, believing the noise frightened predators away. In one valley of Pennsylvania, settlers even set mirrors along fences to confuse the night creatures. Folklorists debate whether this came from European custom or was invented here, born of long hours and creeping fear. You sit awake long after midnight, staring into the fire. The flames twist and crackle, reflecting in the glass of the window until they almost seem alive outside too. The howls fade, replaced by the softer hiss of falling snow. Exhaustion settles in your bones. You close your eyes for a moment, hand resting on the rifle, and drift into uneasy half-sleep. When dawn comes, the silence feels heavier. You step outside into the still air, and the world looks clean, untouched. Then you see it, tracks again, closer this time, looping through the yard before disappearing into the trees. They never approached the door, but you can tell they lingered near the barn. You follow the prints a few steps before stopping. The forest stands calm and bright, indifferent. The wolves have moved on, for now. You breathe deeply, letting the cold fill your lungs. It feels sharp but clean, like new air. You think about the balance that has always existed here, predator and prey, cold and fire, hunger and survival. The settlers wrote about conquering the wilderness, but perhaps that was never true. No one conquers a thing they depend on. You realize that to live here is to live in conversation with danger, not victory over it. Back inside, you hang the rifle on its peg and sit near the fire again. The dog curls up at your feet, its body warm against yours. You scratch behind its ear, grateful for its company. The fire hums softly, and the cabin smells of wood smoke and peace. You think of the wolves out there, padding silently through the snow, their breath rising in plumes beneath the same pale sky. You no longer feel fear, only understanding. They are surviving in their way, just as you are in yours. In an old traveller's letter, written during one such winter, he ends with a line that fits this moment perfectly. The wolves sang to the moon, and I to my fire. We were both just trying to keep the dark away. You sit a little longer, listening. Outside, the forest sleeps again, and the light through the frosted window turns gold. The balance holds. The air changes. You feel it before you see it. The wind that once cut sharp and clean now carries the faintest scent of water and soil. The snow no longer crunches under your boots. It sighs, heavy and damp. When you step outside, the horizon glows faintly pink, and drops of meltwater fall from the eaves with a soft, irregular rhythm. The thaw has begun. Spring on the frontier is not a gentle thing. It arrives suddenly, impatiently, as if the world has grown tired of its own stillness. The ice on the river groans and cracks like a breaking mirror, sending shudders through the air. Streams appear where none existed before, carving new paths through the snow. For a moment, the sound of water everywhere feels joyful, almost holy. Then you remember the danger that comes with it. You stand on the riverbank and watch the ice heave. The surface swells and splits, slabs of white sliding atop each other before vanishing into rushing black water. The sound is deep and relentless, a voice that fills the valley. Every year, someone misjudges this moment, trusting the ice one day too long. In the letters of settlers, the thaw is remembered with both relief and fear. The river gave back what it had taken, one wrote after finding a drowned ox weeks later. Nature returned its debts, but never with mercy. You move along the edge, keeping your distance. The air smells of mud and moss for the first time in months. Beneath the melting snow, the ground oozes and clings to your boots. The forest drips from every branch, droplets falling like beads of glass. The first birds have returned too, timid and thin-voiced. Their calls echo across the clearing, hesitant at first, then confident, as if testing whether the cold is truly gone. Inside the cabin, the warmth feels different now. The fire still burns, but less fiercely. You open the shutter for the first time since autumn and let a faint breeze wander through. It carries the scent of wet bark, soil, and something like possibility. You close your eyes and breathe it in, your lungs aching with gratitude. The dog stirs, yawns, and lies back down, content with the sudden softness in the air. Yet the thaw brings as much trouble as it does relief. Snowmelt turns paths into rivers and cellars into swamps. Barrels swell and split, roofs leak, and everything that had been preserved carefully through winter risks ruin. Mold creeps into the corners of grain stores, and salt turns damp in its barrels. The thaw was called the betrayer by old farmers for a reason. It promised freedom but took its toll before granting it. One of your neighbors once said, "You never trust a thaw until the frogs sing." That was wisdom earned through years of disappointment. Early warmth often ended in frost that returned overnight, killing what dared to bloom too soon. Historians note that frontier diaries are filled with entries describing this cycle of hope and loss. The first buds blackened, the first calves born too early, the first green shoots buried again by surprise snow. Renewal even here demanded patience. You spend the afternoon repairing the cabin's drainage ditch, shoveling slush and mud until your shoulders ache. The earth beneath the snow is slick and dark, rich with decay. Worms twist in the thawing soil. You can almost feel the pulse of the world waking up beneath your feet. The work feels different now, less desperate, more like preparation for something new. In the evening, the sound of dripping water has become constant, a steady percussion against the roof. You sit by the hearth, though the fire burns low. The light outside lasts longer now, stretching into evening like a promise. For the first time in months, you do not feel trapped. The walls around you seem less like boundaries and more like shelter. Old letters describe this time of year as the season of mud and miracles. Farmers wrote of fields reborn overnight and animals venturing out with new energy. But they also warned of sickness that came with the melt fevers rising from the damp air, infections spreading as the ice released what had been buried beneath it. Scholars still debate whether those illnesses were caused by the thaw itself or by the human exhaustion that followed months of tension. Either way, early spring was both a blessing and a test. At dusk, you step outside again. The air hums faintly with water, the river louder now, alive. In the fading light, you see patches of bare ground, dark and glistening like ink. Between them, stubborn clumps of snow remain, shining in the half-light like memories that refuse to fade. The sky above is streaked with gold and violet, and for the first time since autumn, you can smell the earth clearly. You crouch and scoop a handful of wet soil. It's cold and soft, gritty between your fingers, but it feels like hope itself. All through winter, you have watched the world die a little each day. Now, in your hands, is proof that it will live again. As the first stars appear, you stand quietly, listening to the river's song. The air is still cool, but no longer cruel. You can almost imagine the grass returning, the fields greening, the wildflowers pushing through the soil. The thaw is not mercy, it is a reminder that endurance has meaning. You survived the silence, the hunger, the storms, the earth survived too. Inside, you light one last candle before bed. Its flame flickers gently, reflecting off the wet sheen on the window pane. Outside, the water keeps running, steady and endless, as if the land is sighing with relief. Tomorrow, you will begin again, rebuilding what the cold has broken. For tonight, you simply listen to the sound of melting ice and let it sing you to sleep. The morning light feels almost golden now, softer on your skin, warmer on the walls. When you step outside, your boots sink into mud instead of snow, and the air smells like wet leaves and waking earth. A thin mist curls from the ground, and for the first time in months, the sun feels like something more than decoration. It warms your face. It touches the world. The long freeze is finally releasing its grip. You take a slow walk along the edge of the woods. The sound beneath your feet has changed. No more crunch of ice or crack of frost, but a thick, satisfying squelch. The snow is melting in patches, revealing the flattened remains of last year's grass. The ground glistens, and the air vibrates with the soft drip of water falling from branches. Every sense feels alive again. The first task after winter was always the same: cleaning what the cold left behind. You start by dragging broken branches from the yard, clearing away the debris of storms. The logs you stacked months ago have sunk slightly into the earth, their edges damp and mossy. You lift each one carefully, shaking off the mud, stacking them anew. Every motion feels like a quiet declaration that you are still here. Inside the barn, the air is musty but full of promise. The tools hang in a neat row, their metal dulled by rust. You take a rag and begin to polish them one by one. The sound of metal scraping against cloth fills the stillness. Soon, the faint gleam returns. It is slow work, but good work. Settlers used to say that cleaning after winter was the first prayer of spring. It was less about tidiness and more about gratitude, thanking the walls that held, the roof that didn't collapse, the tools that still waited to serve. A curious entry from a frontier diary describes how some families marked the thaw with what they called the airing. On the first warm day, they would open every door and window to let the winter out. Bedding, clothes, and rugs were carried outside, hung in the breeze, and beaten clean with sticks. The writer said the sound of it was like laughter shaking off the snow. You think of that now as you spread your blankets on a fence post, watching the wind ripple through them. The smell of sun-warmed fabric feels almost sacred after so many months of smoke and closed air. Even the animals seem to know the season has changed. The cow bellows softly from its pen, impatient for grass that has not yet grown. The hens scratch at patches of thawed earth, restless and noisy. You scatter the last handful of grain, smiling at their sudden flurry of movement. Life is stirring everywhere, cautious but determined. By midday, the light grows stronger, and you can hear the river in full voice beyond the trees. The ice that once silenced it has vanished, replaced by rushing water that sparkles like broken glass. You walk to the bank and stand for a while, listening. The river sounds impatient, like something long restrained that has finally remembered its freedom. Old journals often speak of this season as both joy and labor. The ground must be ploughed anew, the seeds prepared, the fences repaired where snow and wind tore them apart. A man in an 1824 letter called Spring the busiest mercy of the year. The work was endless, but it came with the promise of harvest and warmth. Hope, like the earth, needed tending. You return to the cabin as the sun begins to dip, its light softening to honey. Inside, the air smells faintly of mud and pine sap. You wash your hands in a basin, watching the water cloud with soil, and for once, dirt does not feel like a stain. It feels like proof of life. Your companion sits near the hearth, mending a basket that cracked in the cold. They look up and smile as you enter, eyes reflecting the fire's low glow. You sit beside them, shoulders touching, both of you silent in the easy way that comes after long months of surviving together. The quiet no longer feels heavy. It feels earned. Later, you cook a small meal, what little remains of dried beans, with a pinch of herbs found near the edge of the forest. The scent is sharp and fresh, almost green. You eat slowly, savoring the taste, grateful not just for the food but for the return of flavor itself. Outside, frogs have begun to sing in the wet hollows near the river, their chorus rising and falling like distant laughter. You remember an old saying you once heard from a farmer: "Spring doesn't come all at once, It sneaks in on frog song. He was right. The sound is steady now, threading through the night, gentle and alive. The world is shifting, almost imperceptibly, from endurance to renewal. Before sleeping, you open the window just enough to let the mild air drift in. The breeze carries the scent of wet bark and thawing earth. It moves softly across your skin, like a hand brushing away the last trace of winter. For months, you have dreamed of warmth, of light, of sound. Now it is all around you, quiet but undeniable. You lie back and listen to the frogs, the dripping water, the faint sigh of wind in the trees. The fire fades to embers. Tomorrow there will be more work planting, mending, preparing for what comes next. But for tonight, the world feels whole again, humming with slow, patient life. The long cold has ended. The land breathes, and so do you. Morning light spills through the cabin window, no longer weak or distant but golden and confident. The ground outside still gleams with dew, and faint curls of mist drift over the river like breath. The air carries that unmistakable scent of wet earth and sap, the smell of beginnings. You stretch your arms and listen to the quiet rhythm of the forest waking. Somewhere nearby, a woodpecker hammers patiently at a tree, and the sound echoes through the thawed air like a heartbeat. You step outside with a shovel slung over your shoulder. It is time to turn the soil. The snow has retreated, leaving behind a patch of dark, rich earth at the edge of the clearing. The ground is soft, cold, and ready. You kneel and press your hand into it. The mud clings to your fingers, gritty and alive. It feels almost like touching time itself. Planting season has arrived, the most hopeful labor of all. Every furrow cut into the ground is an act of faith, a quiet agreement between you and the land. You push the shovel deep and lift the soil, each movement steady, rhythmic. The smell rises like memory of summers past, of sun-warmed fields, of harvests not yet imagined. Settlers depended on these brief months of growth to sustain the rest of the year. They planted corn, beans, squash, and barley, choosing crops that could survive the unpredictable weather. Some families followed methods learned from indigenous neighbors, mixing seeds so that taller plants sheltered smaller ones from wind and sunday. Others used fish scraps as fertilizer, an old trick that left the fields smelling faintly of salt and promise. Modern historians now recognize these techniques as the foundation of sustainable farming in early America. You reach for a small cloth bag filled with seeds saved from last autumn. The kernels are pale and hard, tiny lives waiting to begin again. You sprinkle them into the soil, careful and deliberate. Each seed is a fragment of hope, a reminder that survival is not just about endurance, but renewal. The work is slow but soothing. The rhythm of digging and sowing steadies your thoughts. The sun warms your back, and you can feel the first hint of sweat beneath your collar. The air hums softly with insects testing the new season. For a moment, the silence of winter feels far away, like a dream fading at dawn. A traveler once wrote that the first planting after a long winter feels like writing your name on the earth. You understand that now. Each row you finish feels like a message to the world. I am still here. I still believe in tomorrow. By midday, the sky turns bright blue, streaked with high, thin clouds. You rest on your heels and drink from your flask. The water tastes faintly of iron, cool and sharp. The ground steams gently in the sunday. Across the clearing, your companion tends to the small vegetable patch near the cabin, humming softly while setting up stakes for climbing beans. You watch for a moment, feeling a quiet affection for the way they move, patient and sure, as if this simple act of planting were the center of everything. In the distance, a few other settlers have begun their own fields. You can hear the faint echo of voices, the creak of wooden plows, the clatter of tools. After months of isolation, the sound of neighbors at work feels like the world returning to itself. There is a kind of shared heartbeat in it, a collective determination to begin again. You take up the shovel once more and start a new row. The soil is damp and heavy, clinging to the blade. You move slowly, breathing with the motion, feeling the rhythm settle deep in your muscles. The work is hard, but it carries a peace that nothing else can match. The land gives no guarantees, but it accepts effort as a kind of offering. As the sun lowers, you finish the last furrow and pat the earth gently with your hands. The rows stretch out in neat lines, dark against the pale grass. You feel a deep, wordless satisfaction. The field looks small, almost fragile, yet it holds everything you have left to give. Inside the cabin, the smell of stew fills the air. Your companion has cooked a simple meal of wild greens and dried meat, seasoned with herbs gathered from the forest's edge. You eat slowly, savoring the taste of salt and smoke. The fatigue in your body feels clean, earned. That evening, as the sky fades to violet, you step outside once more. The field lies quiet, wrapped in the dim glow of dusk. You can almost hear the seeds settling into the soil, waiting for warmth. Somewhere nearby, the first crickets begin to sing. Their faint rhythm mixes with the soft rustle of leaves and the murmur of the river. The world feels both vast and tender, full of unseen motion. You think of all the farmers before you who knelt in the same kind of earth, who trusted the same small seeds, who hoped for rain and prayed against frost. Their words might be lost, but their faith lingers in every furrow turned by hand. You whisper a few words of your own, not quite a prayer, but something close. Then you turn back toward the cabin, the fading light painting the field behind you in bronze and shadow. Tomorrow, the sun will rise a little higher, the earth will warm a little more, and beneath the soil, quiet miracles will begin, unseen, but certain. Days begin to stretch longer, their edges softened by mist and birdsong. You wake to the sound of the river running free and steady, no longer roaring with meltwater but humming like a constant song. The air is warm enough that you no longer need the heavy coat waiting by the door. When you step outside, the world feels alive again, filled with the faint chatter of sparrows nesting under the eaves and the gentle sway of branches newly green. The forest is transforming. What was silent and white only weeks ago now ripples with motion. Buds swell along every limb, their green so bright it almost glows. The ground, once hard as iron, has softened into a carpet of moss and new shoots. Each breath tastes of rain and pollen. After months of emptiness, the sight of color feels almost overwhelming. You walk the path toward the edge of the clearing, boots sinking slightly into the soft soil. A mist still hangs above the earth, thin and cool against your skin. The trees drip with dew, and shafts of sunlight break through the canopy, scattering gold over everything they touch. You pause to watch a squirrel dart along a branch, its tail flicking like a banner. The world has started again, and you are part of it. The thaw has revealed the scars of winter, broken fences, fallen limbs, a cracked roof tile on the barn. You run your hand along the wood, rough beneath your fingers, and feel the rhythm of work calling you again. Spring is kind, but she demands effort. Survival may have been the task of winter, but rebuilding belongs to spring. You fetch the tools from the shed, their metal heads cold and dull in the light. The first swing of the hammer sends a clean sound ringing through the air, startling a pair of birds from a nearby bush. You cannot help but smile. That echo, after so many months of muffled silence, feels like a heartbeat returning to the land. Repairs on the frontier were more than maintenance. They were declarations of endurance. Families patched roofs with bark and moss, reinforced walls with mud, and sealed cracks with animal fat. Every repair told a story. A farmer in one surviving diary from 1813 wrote that each spring, the house must be rebuilt from the bones of its own survival. The phrase lingers in your mind as you replace a board on the fence, the wood fresh and pale against the older grey. Your companion joins you, carrying a bucket of nails and a quiet grin. Together, you fall into rhythm, hammer and hand, wood and laughter, silence and sighs. The work is slow, but the sound of it fills the clearing like music. Sweat beads on your forehead, mixing with sawdust and sunlight. The air smells of pine and effort. Later, when the work pauses, you sit together by the riverbank. The water glimmers in motion, clear enough to see the pebbles below. You dip your hands in, the cold biting pleasantly at your skin. The reflection that stares back at you looks older, harder, but also steadier. Winter has carved its lines, but spring has softened them. Across the river, the forest hums with life. Frogs croak in the shallows, and the wind stirs through the leaves with a whisper that sounds almost like speech. For a moment, you imagine the trees remembering everything they have seen. The snow, the storms, the endless stillness. The frontier always keeps its history, though it rarely tells it out loud. As the afternoon warms, you begin mending tools, sharpening blades, oiling handles, tightening rope. The sound of the whetstone against metal is steady and satisfying. Sparks flicker faintly in the sunlight. Each tool, each motion, carries its own kind of memory. You remember how many nights they hung unused, waiting through the cold. Now they are alive again, ready to build instead of merely endure. In the distance, you hear another voice calling a neighbor, perhaps, working their own field. The sound carries clearly through the mild air. You wave, even though they are too far to see it. That simple gesture feels important, a reminder that you are no longer alone. By evening, the air cools again. You finish your repairs and sit outside the cabin, watching the last of the sunlight fade behind the trees. The forest is quiet except for the river and the faint chirp of insects rising into night. A thin wisp of smoke curls from your chimney, mixing with the scent of damp soil and pine. You remember how it felt only months ago, standing in this same place under a sky that seemed endless and cruel. The cold had made everything small. Now the same space feels boundless in another way, open to possibility instead of threat. A traveler once wrote that, "Spring forgives what winter forgets." You think about that as you listen to the slow murmur of the water. The land has forgiven you too, in its way. It has accepted your effort, your patience, your stubborn will to stay. Inside, your companion hums softly while stirring a pot over the fire. The scent drifts outside, warm and comforting. You glance toward the field where small shoots are already visible, tiny points of green pushing through dark soil. The promise of food, of growth, of life. As the last light fades, you sit quietly, letting your hands rest on your knees. Your muscles ache from the day's labor, but the pain feels good, proof of use, proof of purpose. The air cools further, and the first stars begin to appear. The night no longer feels like an enemy. It is simply another rhythm in the long song of survival. You whisper a soft good night to the land, to the river, to the faint light that still clings to the sky. The wind answers gently through the leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a frog croaks once, and then the world falls perfectly still. The air smells of green again. You wake to sunlight streaming through the window, gentle and full of warmth. It slips across the wooden floor, catching in the dust that dances above the hearth. Outside, the birds are loud now, filling the morning with their chatter. The cold months feel like a distant story, something you once survived but can hardly believe was real. You step outside barefoot, the soil cool and soft beneath your feet. The field glows with new life. Rows of seedlings stretch toward the sun, their tiny leaves trembling in the breeze. You crouch down and touch one gently, feeling its thin stem bend under your fingertip. The miracle is quiet but powerful. The earth that once buried you in snow now gives you food. Spring has settled fully over the land. The river runs clear and quick. The trees have grown thick crowns of leaves, and wildflowers bloom in clusters of yellow and violet near the edge of the woods. You breathe deeply, and the air tastes alive, damp, sweet, and clean. Every season on the frontier brought its own labor, but this one carried joy within the work. The days are long now, full of motion. You hoe the soil between the rows of corn, drive new stakes into the ground for beans, patch the animal pen, and carry buckets of water from the stream until your arms ache. Sweat beads along your neck and trickles down your back, but it feels good. almost purifying. Farmers in early letters often wrote that planting was easy compared to tending. Growth required vigilance. Rabbits nibbled the edges of fields, birds stole seeds, and sudden rains could flatten entire rows. You think of those letters as you inspect the small fences around your plot, adjusting each one with care. The stakes stand firm, and for once, the ground beneath your feet feels steady too. You glance toward the cabin. The shutters are open wide, and sunlight spills across the doorway. Your companion kneels near the garden, pulling weeds and humming a tune you recognize. The melody is old and soft, carried here from somewhere far away. The two of you work in companionable silence, broken only by the creak of the water bucket and the sigh of wind through the grass. Around midday, the air grows warm and heavy. You set down your tools and rest in the shade of a tree. Its bark is rough beneath your palm, but the cool shadow feels like a gift. A breeze stirs the leaves above, and the sound ripples through the forest like whispered laughter. You close your eyes and let the peace sink in. There is a saying among old farmers that the land teaches patience before it teaches reward. You understand that now more deeply than ever. Every seed you planted weeks ago has grown according to its own rhythm, untouched by your worry or hurry. Nature moves at the pace it chooses, and you, in learning to wait, have become part of its rhythm. In the distance, thunder murmurs faintly, promising rain by evening. You welcome the thought of it. Rain means life here. The soil will drink deeply, the plants will stretch higher, and the air will cool again. You gather your tools and return to the cabin just as the first drops begin to fall, slow and heavy. Rain on a frontier roof was more than sound, it was comfort. The steady tapping filled every corner of the room, masking the emptiness that silence once carried. You sit near the window and watch the storm unfold. The trees bend and sway, their leaves flashing silver. The scent of wet earth and pine fills the air, rich and clean. Lightning flickers across the sky, not in fury but in rhythm, as though the heavens are breathing with the land. Your companion sets a kettle on the fire and pours you a cup of hot tea brewed from dried mint. The steam curls upward, fragrant and bright. You drink slowly, the warmth spreading through you as the rain grows stronger. For the first time in months, the cold outside feels irrelevant. The world is no longer hostile. It is alive again, and so are you. A curious note survives in a settler's journal describing how the first storm after winter always brought laughter. Families would run outside, faces turned upward, letting the rain soak them until they were dripping wet. It was not madness, the writer said, only the feeling of being born again. You think about that as you stand at the open doorway letting the rain touch your hands. The drops are cool, clean, and real. It feels exactly as he described. As evening falls, the storm passes, leaving behind a golden haze. The river shines like a ribbon of fire under the setting Sunday frogs begin their chorus, and the air hums with insects. You walk to the field once more, the soil dark and glistening beneath your feet. The rows of plants stand taller already, leaves trembling with droplets of light. You kneel and rest your hand against the earth, warm and wet. You whisper something small and private, a thank you perhaps, or maybe just the name of the world itself. The breeze carries your breath away, gentle and kind. When night comes, the air cools and the stars appear, sharp and endless. The wind moves through the forest with a sound like soft applause. You sit outside the cabin until the candlelight behind you fades, listening to the quiet pulse of the living land. Everything that was frozen now flows. Everything that was waiting now grows. You close your eyes and let that truth settle in you. The season has turned completely. Life has returned to the soil, to the river, to your heart. The frontier that once tested you now feels like home. The air is warmer now, heavy with the scent of grass and new blossoms. You wake before sunrise to a chorus of birds that seem to be singing the sky awake. The light that filters through the window is soft and gold, painting the wooden walls with a glow that feels alive. The season of survival has given way to one of abundance. You step outside, and the ground is cool beneath your bare feet, damp with dew. The field that once looked fragile now stretches in green rows, strong and confident. Corn leaves rustle in the breeze, beans twist up their stakes, and the soil hums with quiet life. You stand there for a long moment, breathing in the smell of the growing world. After so many months of snow and silence, this scent feels like a hymn. The work of summer has begun. It is not frantic like winter, nor delicate like spring. It is steady, rhythmic, almost musical. You spend the morning tending the fields, pulling weeds and checking for pests. The sun climbs higher, its heat pressing gently on your shoulders. Sweat gathers on your forehead, but you do not mind. The air itself feels generous now, filled with the promise of everything you've earned. A story you once heard from a traveling farmer comes to mind. He said that every seed carried two kinds of hope, one for food and one for peace. The first filled your stomach, the second filled your soul. You smile at that as you bend over the rows, realizing how true it feels. Each leaf in front of you is a quiet answer to every fear you faced in the cold months. By midday, the heat grows thick. You sit beneath a tree with your companion, sharing bread and dried fruit. The shade feels like a blessing. Bees hum lazily around wildflowers nearby, and the smell of clover drifts through the air. You can hear the steady buzz of insects, the distant murmur of the river, the occasional creak of branches. It is not silence anymore. It is life's quiet song. Letters from settlers often describe summer as the season of gratitude. After months of isolation, people gathered again. Neighbors helped mend barns, traded tools, shared stories. Children ran barefoot through the fields, laughing in the tall grass. Evenings became times of gathering music, shared food, candles glowing through open doors. One diary from 1811 described it perfectly. We lived like the land itself, open and breathing. You imagine those gatherings as you work, the laughter mingling with the hum of crickets and the crackle of fires. Perhaps, when harvest comes, you too will share your food and music with others who endured the same cold. There is comfort in knowing that no one faced the silence alone. In the afternoon, clouds begin to gather over the horizon. You pause, watching their slow approach. They rise tall and white, rolling together like mountains in motion. Soon thunder rumbles, soft but certain. You can smell the storm long before it arrives, that deep, mineral scent of rain waiting to fall. You finish tying the last row of beans and glance toward the cabin, where your companion waves for you to come in. The first drops fall just as you reach the porch. They darken the dust at your feet one by one, until the ground turns black and steaming. The rain builds quickly into a steady curtain, drumming on the roof in a rhythm older than any song. You sit by the window and watch as the field drinks deeply, leaves bending and shining in the storm. Settlers used to say that rain was the land's applause, a kind of blessing given in sound. You think about that as you listen to the downpour. Every drop feels like a promise kept, a reminder that nothing lasts forever. Not cold, not hunger, not fear. The sky itself seems to rejoice in motion. The rain lasts into the evening. When it stops, the air feels new again, cool and sweet. Mist rises from the earth, glowing faintly in the light of the setting Sunday. You walk back into the field, your boots sinking into soft mud. The plants shimmer with water, every leaf catching the last traces of daylight. A rabbit darts across your path, vanishing into the tall grass. Everything around you feels awake, pulsing with quiet joy. You pick a single stalk of young corn and twirl it gently in your hand. The kernels are still forming, hidden and small, but their promise is clear. You think of how many hands before yours have done this same thing, generation after generation, holding the future in their palms. The land does not forget. It rewards patience with life. Night falls slowly. Fireflies appear, flickering among the trees like tiny lanterns. The frogs begin their song again, and the air hums with warmth. You sit outside the cabin, a blanket around your shoulders, and watch the stars bloom across the sky. The constellations feel familiar now, companions rather than distant mysteries. You whisper a quiet thought to the dark, something between gratitude and wonder. You have seen the world frozen and alive, empty and full. You have watched it test you, then forgive you. And now, as summer settles around you like a gentle hand, you finally understand what the frontier teaches best. To live is to listen, to endure, and to begin again. The heat of summer softens at last. The days grow shorter again, their light turning amber and slow. You wake to a faint chill in the air, the kind that hints at change but not yet at hardship. The fields outside are heavy with colour now, golden corn standing tall, beans curled thick around their poles, pumpkins glowing deep orange in the grass. You walk among them with quiet pride, brushing your hand over the leaves. Every stalk, every seed, every blade of green has answered your months of patience. Harvest has come. You fetch the scythe from the barn, its blade sharp and clean, and begin the day's work. The rhythm comes naturally. Swing, breathe, gather. The sound of the blade through the stalks is soothing, a long, steady whisper that fills the space around you. The air smells of sweet grass and earth. Birds hop along the edges of the field, darting for seeds in your wake. You pause often, not from exhaustion but to watch them, to listen to the hum of insects and the wind moving gently through the corn. Harvest was the frontier's final test and greatest joy. It measured every effort, every mistake, every stroke of luck. Early settlers often wrote that a good harvest is proof of grace. The phrase comes to you now, and you understand it differently. It is not divine favor that fills the field, but human endurance. Grace, you realize, is found in the act of staying. You work until your shirt clings with sweat, stacking bundles of grain in neat rows. Your companion joins you, carrying baskets for beans and squash. Together you move through the field in easy rhythm, no words needed. Each basket filled feels like a shared victory. The memory of hunger lingers quietly, but it is no longer a wound. It is a reminder. By late afternoon, the sun drifts low and wide across the horizon. The light turns the landscape to gold, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and ripe fruit. You stop to rest beneath the tree near the riverbank. The water moves lazily now, reflecting the sky like polished glass. You close your eyes for a moment and feel the pulse of the land beneath you. Everything that once seemed cruel now feels generous, even kind. In the old letters you have read, harvest was also a time for reflection. Families gathered, shared food, repaired fences, and prepared for the next winter. But before all that, they gave thanks. Some built small fires at dusk, not for warmth but for memory, each flame representing a lesson learned through hardship. One farmer's note from 1809 described it as lighting the ghosts of winter to sleep. The words feel right. As evening settles, you light your own small fire in the clearing. The smoke rises straight into the still air. Around you, the sounds of night begin. The distant croak of frogs, the sigh of wind through the leaves, the faint rustle of small creatures returning to their burrows. The field glows in the firelight, rows of golden stalks swaying gently like an ocean of quiet triumph. You sit beside the fire with your companion, the basket of vegetables at your feet. You roast a few ears of corn, their husks crackling as they blacken. The taste is sweet, smoky, almost startling after months of hunger and simplicity. You share it in silence, content just to exist within this small circle of warmth and light. The stars begin to appear one by one, pale at first, then bright. The night stretches deep and endless above you. You tilt your head back and trace the familiar constellations, the same ones that guided sailors across oceans and travelers through forests. Out here, under this sky, time feels both immense and small. The same stars that watched the first settlers now watch you. A soft wind stirs the ashes of the fire, carrying their glow upward like tiny embers seeking the heavens. You watch them fade and think about everything that has passed. The snow that buried the world, the storms that shook the roof, the silence that tested your mind. You remember the hunger, the fear, the long nights when hope felt like smoke itself, and yet, through it all, you endured. The frontier is no longer a place of suffering in your eyes. It is a mirror, showing you what survival really means: patience, humility, persistence. The cold did not break you, it shaped you. The wind taught you resilience, the hunger taught you gratitude, the thaw taught you wonder. And now, under this vast, forgiving sky, the harvest teaches you peace. You look toward the cabin. Its window glows softly, a single square of light in the darkness. The air is cool now, touched with the faint promise of autumn. You rise slowly, brush the dirt from your hands, and smile. Tomorrow you will store the grain, seal the jars, mend the roof again. Life will continue in its rhythm of work and rest, hardship and grace. For tonight, you simply listen. The fire crackles low, the river murmurs nearby, and the crickets sing their endless lullaby. You lean back and breathe deeply, filling your lungs with the scent of wood smoke and warm earth. The stars shimmer above, quiet and infinite. You feel their calm settle over you, soft and sure. The year has turned full circle. The cold will return someday, as it always does, but now you know it will not defeat you. The land will sleep, the snow will fall, and you will endure again, warmed by memory and faith. Sleep comes slowly, gently like the turning of the seasons. You close your eyes, the firelight flickering behind your lids, and let the sound of the night carry you away. And now, as the fire fades to its final ember, you feel the world around you exhale. The long story of winter and survival has ended, not with triumph or defeat, but with stillness. The night stretches wide and kind. You can almost hear the land breathing beside you, the quiet rhythm of something vast and ancient. The stars shimmer softly above, silver dust scattered across an endless sky. Their light reaches you like a gentle whisper from centuries away. You lie back and let that glow sink into your skin, letting it replace every cold moment you remember. The earth beneath you is warm, the air tender, the silence deep enough to hold dreams. The memory of hardship feels distant now, softened by time. The snow, the storms, the hunger, they were chapters, not chains. The frontier has become something more than survival. It is the story of patience rewarded, of effort turned into beauty. The world that once froze you now rocks you to rest. A breeze drifts through the grass, cool and fragrant, carrying the faint hum of night insects. The sound blends with your heartbeat until you cannot tell where you end and the land begins. The frontier is not a place anymore. It is a feeling, steady and eternal. You belong to it now. You breathe out once more, long and slow, and feel the weight of the seasons fall away. Tomorrow, the world will wake again, bright and full of motion. But for now, you rest in this quiet miracle of peace, safe and whole beneath the stars. Good night, traveler. Sleep well. The fire will keep burning for you until morning.